Buenos Aires in 1971 did not hurry itself. It moved the way honey moves in a spoon, slow and shining, lingering on the edge of every moment before deciding to fall. Late afternoon light spilled down the long avenues and softened the stone facades, turning balconies into quiet stages and window panes into pale mirrors. The city held a warmth that was not heat but memory, a warmth gathered from thousands of footsteps and the patient swing of tram cables overhead. Even the air seemed to carry a faint sweetness, as if the river had breathed it in and exhaled it back toward the streets. Somewhere far off, the Rio de la Plata lay wide and silvery, and closer in, the cafes began to wake, pushing their chairs outward as though making room for the evening to sit down and stay. On a corner where two streets met at a thoughtful angle, a cafe with worn wooden tables and a striped awning let out the scent of coffee and orange peel. The aroma drifted into the street and mingled with the perfume of jacaranda blossoms, though the season was not quite right for them to be extravagant. Buenos Aires was like that. It offered beauty even when it was not required. Above the cafe, reached by a narrow stairway tucked beside a newspaper stand, there was a dance studio with frosted windows and a door painted a deep, calm blue. The sign beside it was modest, almost shy, with letters that had faded into a gentle gray. Academia de Tango, Clases al atardecer. Beneath that, in smaller writing that looked newer, as if it had been added after someone argued for it, there was a second line. Para quienes ya no creen en el amor. For those who no longer believe in love, the words were not dramatic. They were simply there, like a truth said softly enough that it would not startle anyone. People passed under that sign without looking up, and some did look up and pause, and then keep walking as if they had seen their own reflection in a shop window and decided not to stop. Now and then, someone climbed the stairs, and the steps creaked in a friendly way, as if acknowledging a familiar kind of hesitation. The studio did not advertise with bright posters. It did not need to. Those who found it were not looking for noise. They were looking for something quieter than hope, something steadier than longing. They were looking for a place where sadness could sit down without being questioned, and where a person could move without having to explain why their heart had grown cautious. That evening, Lucia Echeverria stood across the street and watched the building as the sky shifted from gold to apricot. She was 28, and she carried herself with the careful poise of someone who had learned not to spill what she held inside. Her hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, not for vanity, but for control, as if loose strands might give away thoughts she preferred to keep hidden. Her dress was simple, pale in color, with sleeves that reached her elbows and a hem that fell just below her knees. She looked like a woman who could be mistaken for calm, and in a certain sense, she was. Calm had become one of her skills, cultivated the way a person cultivates a garden in a city courtyard, patiently for survival, choosing what could grow and trimming what could not. She had not come because she loved tango. Lucia had danced as a girl at family weddings, laughing with cousins, spinning until her cheeks were pink and her feet hurt. Those memories belonged to another life, one in which she had believed that laughter and love were cousins too, always arriving together. Now, she had come because she wanted to forget, and because forgetting, she had learned, was not achieved by sitting still. The mind, when left alone, wandered back to old rooms, old words, old hands that had once held hers too tightly, or not tightly enough. The body, however, could be taught something new. The body could be given rhythm and rules. The body could step forward and step back and learn that it did not have to fall into the same pattern, simply because it had done so before. Lucia let a few people pass between her and the stairway, allowing herself time to breathe. She listened to the city. A bus sighed at a stop. A man called out the evening edition of a newspaper in a voice that rose and fell like a song. Somewhere nearby, a radio played a melody so distant it seemed to come from another street, another hour. The sound of it did not hurt. That was something, she thought. Some sounds still did not hurt. She pressed her fingertips lightly to the strap of her handbag as if to remind herself she was here, in the present, in a city that continued to glow no matter what she carried. When she finally crossed the street, she did it with quiet decisiveness. The stairway beside the café was narrow, and the wall along it bore faint traces of old posters, layers of paper that had been peeled away and pasted over again and again. Each step creaked as she climbed, and the creaks felt almost like encouragement. The light changed as she ascended, becoming softer, more private. By the time she reached the blue door, the city's noise had thinned into a distant hum like the sea heard from far inland. She paused with her hand hovering near the brass knob, and in the frosted glass she saw only a blurred suggestion of her own shape, indistinct and safe. Inside, the studio was larger than it appeared from the street. Wooden floors stretched wide and polished, reflecting the ceiling lamps in long, pale streaks. One wall was lined with mirrors, and the opposite wall held tall windows draped in gauzy curtains that made the last daylight look like it had been filtered through milk. A few chairs rested along the edges of the room, and in the corner there was a record player with a stack of vinyls arranged neatly beside it. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and lavender, as though someone had decided the room should feel like a clean house rather than a performance hall. It was not a place that demanded. It was a place that invited. Several people were already there, speaking in low voices, or not speaking at all. Their clothing varied, but their expressions carried a shared reserve, a gentle caution that was not hostility, but self-protection. Lucia understood it immediately. It was the look of people who had once leaned forward too far and then learned, in one sharp moment, what it meant to lose balance. She took her place near the wall and set her handbag on a chair, smoothing her skirt as if smoothing her thoughts. She did not search for anyone. She did not expect anything. She told herself this was not a story beginning. This was simply a lesson. The door opened again a few minutes later, and a man stepped in, bringing with him a draft of cooler air and the faint scent of the street. Rain that had not yet fallen, smoke from a distant grill, the iron tang of tram lines. His name, though Lucia did not yet know it, was Tomás Vidal. He was 32, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and a face that seemed composed of quiet lines rather than sharp angles. He wore a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, and his shoes were polished, but not showy. There was something deliberate in the way he moved, as if he had learned to place each step with care. He looked around once, not searching for attention, and then his gaze settled briefly on the mirrors, as though checking that he existed there as well as in his own thoughts. Tomás had come to remember, not in the simple sense of recalling facts. He could remember dates and names easily enough. He remembered the smell of his mother's kitchen in winter. He remembered the sound of his father humming while shaving. He remembered how the city looked at dawn when the streets were empty and the river's breath reached farther inland. But there were other things he feared he had lost, things that did not return just because he asked them to. He had lost a certain ease of feeling, a softness of trust. He had lost the ability to let happiness arrive without immediately preparing for its departure. And somewhere in him, beneath all the careful discipline of adulthood, There was a young man who had once believed that love could be strong without being consuming, and that closeness did not have to mean surrender. He had heard about this class from an elderly tailor who worked near his office, a man who measured fabric with the same solemnity he might use to measure time. "It's a strange advertisement," the tailor had said, not unkindly. "But perhaps it is honest. And perhaps honesty is what people need more than romance." Tomas had nodded, as if he understood, though he was not sure he did. He had walked past the building twice before finding the courage to climb the stairs on the third evening, telling himself each time that he was only curious. Yet curiosity, he knew, was often the first form of hope. He did not want to call it that. He did not want to name it and make it fragile. Still, his feet had carried him here. Lucia felt his arrival before she looked at him. There was a shift in the room's quiet, a subtle rearrangement, as if the air itself had made space. She turned her head, and their eyes met briefly in the mirror's reflection rather than directly, which softened the moment and made it easier to bear. Tomas's gaze was calm. It did not probe. It did not linger in a way that asked her to respond. It simply noticed her presence, as one might notice the first star appearing in an evening sky. Lucia looked away without urgency and returned her attention to her hands, which she clasped lightly at her waist. She felt, in a small and surprising way, the relief of being seen without being claimed. A woman entered then, older than the others, with silver hair pinned in a neat coil and a posture that suggested years of listening to music with her whole body. She wore a dark dress that moved softly around her ankles. Her name was Señora Valeria Rojas, the instructor, though she introduced herself simply as Valeria, as if titles were unnecessary in a room where people were trying to unlearn their defenses. She smiled at the group, and her smile did not promise miracles. It promised practice. "Good evening," she said, her voice low and even. "Welcome. You are here because something in you still wants to move. That is enough." She let silence settle after her words, allowing them to land gently. "We will begin simply. We will begin with how to stand, how to breathe, how to offer space, and how to hold it. Tango is not about possession. It is about presence." Lucia listened, as if the words were being spoken directly to her. Presence, space, breath. These were things she could manage. These were things she could learn. Tomas listened too, his shoulders easing a fraction, as though he had been holding them tight without realizing. Around them, the other students, men and women, young and old, shifted their weight, adjusted their clothing, looked toward the polished floor. No one laughed. No one made small talk to fill the room. The quiet was not awkward. It was intentional, like a candle flame that did not flicker. Valeria guided them into a simple line and showed them how to place their feet, how to distribute weight, how to feel the floor's support without gripping with their toes. "The earth is not asking you to prove anything," she murmured. "Let it hold you." She demonstrated a basic stance, her movements gentle and precise, and the room seemed to slow around her, as if respecting her pace. The lamps above cast warm circles of light, and the last daylight behind the curtains faded into a deeper hush. Outside, the café below would be filling with voices and clinking cups. Up here, the world narrowed into wood and breath and the small, steady instruction of bodies learning again. Lucia found herself breathing more deeply than she had on the street. Each inhale was quiet and full. Each exhale felt like letting go of a thread she had been holding between her teeth. Tomas stood a few spaces away, mirroring the posture Valeria had shown, his hands relaxed at his sides. He did not look like a man searching for rescue. He looked like a man trying to remember how it felt to be steady. Lucia, for her part, did not feel like a woman seeking distraction. She felt like a woman preparing to empty a room in her mind so that something calmer could enter. Valeria's voice continued, slow as a lullaby. "Tonight," she said, "we will not dance yet. Tonight we will learn the city's rhythm, because tango belongs to Buenos Aires the way twilight belongs to evening. Listen, the city has a heartbeat. You do not need to chase it. It will meet you where you are." She went to the record player and set a vinyl on the turntable with reverent care. The needle touched down with a soft crackle, and then the music arrived, bandoneon and piano, a melody that seemed to step forward and then pause, as if considering whether to continue. The sound filled the room not as noise but as atmosphere, like warm air spreading through a house. Lucia felt it in her ribs. Tomas felt it in his shoulders. The other students softened around the edges, their faces easing into an expression that was neither joy nor sorrow, but something tender and neutral. Something safe. Buenos Aires outside continued to glow in late light, and inside this quiet studio above a café, a small group of people stood and breathed and listened, as if learning for the first time in a long while that the world could hold them gently. And in that moment, before any steps were taken, before any hands met, two strangers, Lucia, who had come to forget, and Tomas, who had come to remember, found themselves in the same soft pocket of evening, suspended in the kind of calm that makes the heart feel less like a wound and more like a doorway. The music did not hurry them into motion. It remained patient, circling the room like a kind presence that had come only to keep them company. Valeria let the first minutes pass with nothing more demanded than attention. She watched their shoulders and their hands, the tiny signs of a body bracing for disappointment, and she seemed to understand that most people arrived at a studio like this carrying invisible luggage. Some carried grief in an elegant suitcase. Some carried anger in a paper bag that threatened to tear. Some carried numbness like a heavy coat worn in summer. And some, like Lucia, carried a silence so carefully folded that it looked like composure until it unfolded. Valeria's gaze did not pry. It softened. Her voice remained low and steady, like a candle held near trembling fingers. "You will hear many stories about tango," she said, standing at the front where the floor shone brightest. "People will tell you it is seduction. They will tell you it is conquest. They will tell you it is a duel dressed in music. I am not interested in those stories." She paused, allowing the record's gentle crackle to fill the space between sentences. "In this room, tango is a conversation. It is an agreement made moment by moment. It is a way of saying, I am here and I will not take more than you offer." Lucia absorbed the words as if they were warm water poured slowly over stone. She had expected something sharper, something theatrical, an insistence that passion must be fierce to be real. Instead, Valeria spoke as though tenderness could be disciplined, as though romance could be steady rather than hungry. Lucia did not yet know whether she believed such a thing, but she felt the relief of hearing it proposed. The relief was small, and she held it with caution, the way one holds a delicate glass. Across the room, Tomas stood quietly, his weight balanced in the stance Valeria had shown them. The music seemed to settle into his posture. His face was calm, but his eyes carried an attentive seriousness, as if he were listening not only to the bandoneon, but to something inside himself that had been quiet for a long time. Valeria walked among them, adjusting shoulders with a light touch, nudging a foot a fraction outward, reminding a student to soften the jaw. Each correction felt like an invitation rather than a criticism. "The body," she murmured. tells the truth, even when the mouth has learned to lie. If you want to begin again, begin with your breath. If you want to learn boundaries, learn where you end. She spoke this last phrase without emphasis, and yet it echoed in Lucia's mind as if it had been struck like a bell. Where you end. It sounded so simple, almost obvious, and yet Lucia realized how often she had lived as if the line of herself could be crossed without her permission. She had not always been pushed. Sometimes she had stepped aside on her own, making space for another's needs until she no longer recognized the shape of her own. The class shifted from stillness into slow practice. Valeria asked them to walk alone first, without partners, as if reacquainting themselves with their own presence. They moved in a loose circle around the room, each person taking steps that were smaller than ordinary walking, measured and deliberate. The sound of soles against wood created a quiet rhythm beneath the music, like a second heartbeat. Lucia felt strange at first, as if she were performing a task too intimate to do in front of others. Then she noticed that no one was watching with judgment. Everyone's eyes were softened inward, attentive to their own balance, their own breath. The room did not feel like a stage. It felt like a sanctuary for practice. Tomas walked in the same circle, a few paces behind Lucia. He did not attempt to catch up, did not close the distance for the sake of it. His steps were steady and respectful, and there was something in that restraint that made the air feel safer. He had spent years, he realized, believing that if he did not move forward decisively, life would pass him by. Yet here, the slow pace felt like permission. It was not stagnation. It was presence, the quiet assurance that he could remain in a moment without losing it. Valeria clapped her hands once, gently, as if waking a sleeping bird. "Now," she said, "we will speak about the embrace, but we will not do it yet. I want you to understand what it is before you touch another person." The students slowed and gathered near the mirrors. Their reflections formed a softened line of faces, some tired, some guarded, some hopeful in ways they did not dare to name. Valeria stood before them and held her hands in front of her chest, palms facing each other with space between. An embrace is not a trap. It is not a claim. It is a shared shape, created together. In tango, you do not pull someone into your world. You meet in the space between. Her eyes moved across the room and lingered, briefly, on those who looked the most wary. If you have ever been held too tightly, you will learn here how to loosen without fleeing. If you have ever held too tightly, you will learn here how to offer without gripping. Lucia felt the words settle into her ribs. Held too tightly. She did not think of bruises or force. She thought of expectation, that quiet pressure that had once wrapped around her like ivy. She thought of a voice saying, softly but insistently, "If you loved me, you would." She had not been threatened. She had been persuaded, again and again, to make her boundaries smaller. She remembered the slow shrinking, the way her own wants began to sound selfish in her mind. Now, in Valeria's studio, the idea that an embrace could be a shared shape rather than a surrender felt almost magical, like learning a new rule of physics. Tomas, listening, felt a different ache. Held too tightly, yes, but also held too loosely. He remembered a love that had slipped away, not with a dramatic rupture, but with quiet neglect, the slow fading of attention until the relationship became a room with the lights turned off. He had not been abandoned in a single moment. He had been left in installments, each one small enough to rationalize. He had promised himself afterward that next time he would hold tighter, be more vigilant, demand more certainty. Yet certainty, he was beginning to suspect, was not something that could be squeezed from another person. Perhaps what he needed was not a firmer grip, but a clearer agreement. Valeria returned to the record player and changed the music, choosing something slower, a piece with long pauses that seemed to breathe. "Partners," she said, "will change in this class. Not because we are careless with connection, but because we are careful. You will learn that your worth does not depend on one person's hands. You will learn that respect can be practiced, not begged for." She let the words rest, then added, almost as an afterthought, "And you will learn to say yes and no with your body, without apology." A gentle murmur moved through the group, not conversation, but nervous acknowledgement. Pairing up was always the moment when a room changed. Lucia felt her stomach tighten. Tomas felt his throat constrict slightly, as if bracing for rejection. Valeria's calm remained unbroken. She directed them with simple gestures, guiding people toward each other like a gardener arranging flowers so they might all receive light. Lucia found herself facing a woman about her age with kind eyes and a modest smile. Tomas was paired with an older man who looked like he had once been handsome in a careless way, and now carried that handsomeness with humility. Lucia placed her hand in her partner's, and the touch was light, almost ceremonial. Valeria had them begin with the simplest connection, a handhold, then a release, then again. "Do not cling," Valeria instructed. "Do not disappear. Feel the contact as a point, not a chain." Lucia noticed how her fingers wanted to tighten automatically, as if to prevent the other person from leaving. The impulse surprised her. She had thought her problem was giving too much, yet here was another truth. She had learned, somewhere along the way, to treat connection as something that might vanish if she did not secure it. She loosened her grip deliberately, feeling the quiet fear that came with letting the contact be gentle. Nothing terrible happened. The hand remained. The moment remained. Tomas, holding his partner's hand, noticed his own tendency toward control. His palm wanted to guide too strongly, to direct rather than invite. Valeria moved past them and touched his wrist lightly, a correction so subtle it felt like kindness. "Offer," she said softly, "and then listen." Tomas adjusted, easing the pressure. Immediately the connection felt clearer, as if air had entered a room. His partner's posture softened, responding not to force, but to invitation. Tomas felt something inside him relax. A memory, perhaps, of how love had once felt before fear taught him to grip. The exercise progressed into a basic frame. Valeria demonstrated how to stand with a partner without collapsing into them. "You are not leaning," she said. "You are sharing balance." The students tried, awkwardly at first, their bodies cautious as deer. Lucia's first attempt felt too stiff. Her shoulders rose defensively. Valeria approached and placed a hand between Lucia's shoulder blades, warm and steady. "Let your heart be in the room," she murmured, "but do not hand it over." The phrase slid into Lucia's mind like a key into a lock. Let your heart be in the room, not hidden, not exposed, present. As partners rotated, Lucia felt the rhythm of meeting and parting, each change teaching her that connection could be temporary without being tragic. She noticed the small differences between people. A man who held his breath, a woman whose hands trembled, another who smiled too brightly, as if apologizing for being there. The room became a gentle study of human longing and caution, of the ways people carried their histories in their shoulders. Tomas, too, moved from partner to partner, learning to adjust, to sense, to wait. Each new connection was an exercise in humility, a reminder that not everyone wanted the same closeness, and that closeness did not mean the same thing to everybody. Then, in a moment that felt both accidental and inevitable, Valeria's hand guided Lucia toward a new partner, and Lucia turned to find Tomas standing in front of her. The room seemed to quiet further, as if leaning in to listen. Lucia met his eyes directly this time. There was no sharpness there, no demand, only a steady attentiveness, like a man listening to rain through an open window. Tomas inclined his head slightly, a gesture that felt like respect rather than charm. Lucia offered her hand, and he took it with a careful gentleness that made her chest loosen on an exhale she had not known she was holding. "Light," Valeria's voice came from nearby, as if she could sense the importance of this pairing and wanted to keep it safe. "Let the hands meet, and let them be free to part. Remember, you are both complete. The dance is what happens between two complete people." Lucia and Tomas followed the instruction. Their fingers touched, then adjusted, finding a comfortable point of contact. Lucia felt the warmth of his skin, and with it, the quiet fact of another person's reality. Tomas felt the steadiness of her hand, neither limp nor rigid, and he sensed a kind of dignity in her restraint. They practiced the frame, not yet an embrace, just the structured geometry of bodies aligning. Lucia's shoulders wanted to tense. Tomas's hand wanted to guide too firmly. Together, they moderated, as if learning a shared language with careful pronunciation. The music moved slowly, and Valeria guided them through the simplest beginning. A shift of weight, a pause, another shift. No forward steps yet, no backward steps yet. Only learning how to be connected without rushing to go anywhere. Lucia discovered that the pauses were not empty. They were full of listening. Tomas discovered that stillness could contain trust. Around them, other pairs practiced, the studio filled with the soft sound of breathing and shoes whispering over polished wood. When Valeria called the class to a close, the students released their partners with a quiet politeness, as if returning borrowed books. The record player spun down, and the room's silence returned, gentle and unbroken. Lucia gathered her handbag, smoothing her skirt again, feeling the strange, faint calm of someone who has walked into a feared place and found it kind. Tomas buttoned his cuffs and glanced toward the windows, where the curtains glowed softly with the last trace of evening. They did not speak to each other yet. They did not need to. Something had already been established. Not intimacy, not promise, but a shared understanding of the room's purpose. As they descended the stairs separately into the cafe's warm noise and the street's cooling air, Buenos Aires continued to move at its slow, shining pace. The city lights began to turn on one by one, like quiet thoughts. Lucia walked toward her apartment with a steadier breath. Tomas walked toward his with a gentler mind. Neither of them called it hope. They did not have to. For tonight, it was enough that their bodies had learned one simple truth. Connection could be practiced with care, and care could feel like rest. The next evening arrived with the same unhurried grace, as though Buenos Aires had decided to repeat a kindness. The sky held a soft pearled light that made the edges of buildings look gentler than they did at noon, and the city's sounds seemed wrapped in velvet. Buses humming, footsteps murmuring, distant voices rising and falling like quiet waves. When Lucia reached the cafe corner, she paused only briefly, less to gather courage than to recognize the small shift inside herself. She was not forcing her feet forward. They were already moving. That, she thought, was a kind of progress, though it did not feel triumphant. It felt like a door opening without a struggle, as if the lock had loosened simply because she had returned. Inside the studio, the air was familiar now. The beeswax scent still rested in the wood, and the lavender note lingered like a gentle promise. The lamps were lit earlier than the night before, their warm circles placed carefully along the ceiling so no corner felt harsh. Students arrived in quiet succession, some nodding at one another with the faint recognition of shared effort. Lucia took her place near the same chair along the wall, setting her handbag down as if placing a burden aside. She noticed that her shoulders were not as high. Her breath did not snag so easily. She was still cautious, still guarded in ways she did not yet know how to undo. But her caution had softened from armor into something more like a shawl. Protective, yes, but not heavy enough to stop her from moving. Tomas arrived a few minutes later, and the room seemed to widen to accommodate him, not because he demanded space, but because he carried quiet. He wore the same plain white shirt, sleeves rolled again, as if making ritual of readiness. He glanced toward the mirrors, then toward the windows, and finally, his gaze found Lucia, briefly, respectfully. There was no quick smile, no unnecessary charm, only the acknowledgement of someone who remembered her hand in his the night before and had not tried to turn it into more than it was. Lucia felt that acknowledgement in her chest as a small warmth that did not burn. It simply rested there, calm and steady. Valeria entered with her usual composed presence, bringing with her the sense that the evening would be guided rather than pushed. She greeted them with a nod that felt like recognition of their choice to return, then moved to the record player with the same deliberate care she used when placing her hands in frame. The music she chose tonight was quieter, the bandoneon voice low and deep, the piano notes spaced as though they were learning not to crowd one another. It was not music for display. It was music for listening. Tonight, Valeria said, turning to face the group, we begin the walk. She let the word settle. The walk is the heart of tango, not the turns, not the flourishes. The walk, simple, honest. You will learn to step forward, to step back, and to pause. You will learn that the pause is not emptiness. It is a decision. Her gaze moved across them, as if checking who was ready for this particular truth. In life, people often step forward without knowing why, or they step back without admitting fear. In tango, we do neither without awareness. She directed them to pair up, and this time the movement toward partners felt less tense, more practiced, as if the body had learned that this room did not punish. Lucia found herself paired with Tomas again, not by chance alone, but by Valeria's careful arranging. Lucia's heartbeat quickened, but the feeling was not alarm. It was attention. Tomas offered his hand, and Lucia placed hers in it, the contact light and precise. Valeria's earlier words returned. Two complete people. Lucia felt the comfort of that phrase, the way it drew a line around her that she could inhabit without apology. Choose roles, Valeria instructed, not by habit but by intention. Leaders, followers, these are not hierarchies, they are responsibilities. She walked among the pairs as they considered. Leader, she added softly, is not the one who controls. Leader is the one who proposes. Follower is not the one who submits. Follower is the one who translates. She paused near Lucia and Tomas, her eyes warm. Both must listen. Both must say yes and no. Lucia surprised herself by speaking first. Her voice was quiet, but clear. I will follow, she said, and the decision felt like exhaling. She did not choose it because she wanted to be guided in life. She chose it because she wanted to rest from deciding for a while, to learn what it felt like to receive information and respond with her own language. She wanted to practice trust in a setting where trust had structure. Tomas nodded, and accepted the leader's role, not with pride, but with a sober attentiveness. He had always believed leadership meant certainty. Here, under Valeria's gaze, he began to understand it meant responsibility for the other person's comfort as much as the direction of movement. Valeria positioned them in the center of the room, facing the mirrors, and adjusted their frame with small corrections. "Close enough to share a world," she murmured. "Not so close that you lose your own." Lucia felt Tomas's right hand settle lightly on her shoulder blade, a touch that was supportive rather than possessive. Her left hand rested in his right, and her right hand found the top of his shoulder with a gentle steadiness. Their chests did not press together. There was space, and in that space there was breathing room, a place for choice. Lucia realized that some of her fear of closeness came not from closeness itself, but from closeness without consent. This, she thought, could be consent. This could be a shared decision. "Now," Valeria said, "before you move, feel your weight. Feel the floor. Feel your partner. Do not anticipate. Do not rush to impress. Let the music speak first." The bandoneon held a long note, then released it, like a sigh. Tomas waited, listening not only to the music, but to Lucia's breathing, the subtle shifts in her posture. He felt the temptation to begin too soon, to prove he could lead. He resisted it. He remembered Valeria's instruction: offer, then listen. When he finally proposed the first step, it was almost invisible. A gentle shift of his weight forward, a quiet invitation carried through the frame. Lucia felt it as a suggestion rather than a push. She responded by stepping back, a small, smooth movement that surprised her with its calmness. Her heel met the wood with a soft whisper. She did not stumble. She did not tense. She simply moved. The simplicity of it felt like a small miracle. Valeria's voice drifted near them, calm as sleep. "Yes," she said, as if speaking to the air itself. "Follower, your first step is often backward. People misunderstand this. They think it is retreat. They think it is refusal. But it is not. It is trust. It is the willingness to make space so the dance can exist." She let the words hang, then added, "And leader, your first step forward must not be hunger. It must be care. If you step forward too fast, you steal the follower's choice. If you step forward too slow, you abandon the conversation." Lucia continued to step back with each proposal, discovering that backward movement could feel strong. It required steadiness, awareness, and an acceptance of what lay behind without fear. Tomas stepped forward with matching attention, careful not to crowd her, careful not to use his size or certainty as leverage. With each step, Lucia sensed that tango was not a romance of collapsing into each other. It was a romance of staying distinct while moving together. The idea soothed her in a way she had not expected. It made love feel less like drowning and more like walking beside a river, close enough to hear it, far enough to breathe. They practiced the pattern again and again. Forward for him, backward for her, then a pause. Valeria emphasized the pause as if it were sacred. "Stop," she said, and the pair stilled. The music continued, but the bodies held quiet. In the pause, she continued softly, "You check in. You ask, are we still together? Are we still comfortable? Do we continue?" Lucia felt the pause as a place where she could make a decision without words. Tomas felt it as a place where he could listen without guessing. The pause did not interrupt the dance. It deepened it. As the class continued, Valeria rotated partners briefly so that everyone could feel different bodies, different ways of responding. Lucia danced with an older man whose steps were hesitant but sincere, then with a young woman whose posture was tense as a drawn bow. Each partner taught Lucia something about herself, how quickly she adjusted, how easily she over-accommodated, how often she tried to predict what the other person wanted. Valeria's gentle reminders brought her back. "Do not preempt," she murmured. "Respond. Let the proposal arrive first." Tomas danced with different followers too, each one revealing his own habits. With one partner, he became too cautious, fearing he would lead wrongly. With another, he became too firm, trying to compensate for her uncertainty. Valeria corrected him with the same steady clarity. "You are not here to rescue," she said quietly as she passed him. "You are here to converse. Rescue creates debt. Conversation creates respect." When Lucia and Tomas were paired again, the reconnection felt smoother, as if their bodies had learned each other's language in small syllables. Lucia's backward steps became more confident, her weight transfers more fluid. Tomas's forward steps became more precise, his proposals more readable. Neither of them smiled broadly, but there was a softness in their faces, a loosening around the eyes. They were not falling into romance. They were falling into rhythm, and rhythm was a safer kind of surrender. Near the end of the lesson, Valeria gathered the group close. She turned down the music slightly, as if inviting them into a more intimate quiet. "Remember this," she said, her voice low. "In tango, you are always learning when to advance and when to stop. Forward is not always brave. Backward is not always fear. Sometimes stepping back is how you keep yourself safe. Sometimes stopping is how you keep the other safe." She looked at them with a kindness that did not pity. "What you practice here is not only dance, it is discernment." Lucia felt the words settle in her mind like a soft stone. Discernment. She had spent too long believing that love meant saying yes until there was nothing left to give, and that boundaries were proof of coldness. Tonight, she had stepped backward again and again and discovered it could be a form of clarity. Tomas, standing nearby, felt his own lesson take shape. Moving forward with care was not weakness, it was strength. It required restraint, patience, and the willingness to be guided by another person's comfort rather than his own urgency. When class ended, the students released each other with quiet courtesy. The studio seemed to exhale, as if satisfied with the evening's gentle work. Lucia gathered her handbag and looked toward the windows, where the curtains held the last of the city's glow. Tomas adjusted his sleeves and glanced toward the mirrors, seeing not only his own reflection, but the reflection of a man who had begun to remember something simpler than loss, the possibility of moving in connection without fear. They descended the stairway again, separately, but aware of each other, in the same way one is aware of a nearby lamp in the dark. Outside, Buenos Aires had deepened into night, streetlights casting pools of warm brightness on the pavement. The café below hummed with quiet conversation, cups clinking, laughter kept gentle. Lucia stepped into the street and felt for a moment the subtle echo of the dance in her body. Forward, back, pause. She did not know what she would forget, or how long it would take. Tomas did not know what he would remember, or when it would return fully. Yet both of them carried the same calm understanding home through the city's late light. Love, like tango, did not require constant advance. It required knowing when to move and knowing when to stop, and trusting that the space between could be part of the music. The week unfolded in a slow, gentle sequence, each evening arriving with the soft inevitability of a tide. Buenos Aires seemed to understand the rhythm of their new routine and offered itself accordingly, warm light on stone, a breeze that carried the scent of bread from corner bakeries, the distant hush of the river beyond the buildings. Lucia began to notice small details she had previously walked past without seeing. A tiled doorway painted in pale blue, a woman watering plants on a balcony, moving as carefully as if her hands were part of a prayer, the way café windows glowed from within, making the streets look as though they were lined with small hearths. These things did not erase what she wanted to forget, but they softened it, the way a blanket does not remove cold air, yet makes it easier to endure. She found herself arriving at the Tango studio with less resistance each night, as if her body recognized the stairway as a path toward quiet rather than toward risk. Inside the room, the class continued with the same deliberate gentleness. Valeria never raised her voice. She never used sharp corrections. She taught the way one teaches a lullaby, repeating the essential phrases until the body began to remember them without strain. The mirrors along the wall reflected not performances, but practice. Shoulders lowering, jaws unclenching, hands learning to meet and separate without panic. Valeria spoke often of the frame, of how to hold oneself in relationship without collapsing or hardening. "Your frame," she said, moving among them with her calm, steady hands, "is not a wall. It is not a cage. It is a boundary that lets you stay present." The words settled over the class like a soft shawl, warming without weighing down. Lucia felt those lessons in the most unexpected places. She felt them when she stood at her kitchen sink, rinsing a cup, noticing how her shoulders wanted to tense without reason. She felt them when a neighbor asked a small favor, and she considered, for the first time in a long while, whether she truly wanted to agree. The question did not feel selfish, it felt honest. In the studio, she practiced holding her own axis while responding to another's movement. Outside, she began to practice the same thing in small social exchanges, letting her yes be real and her no be quiet and clean. It was not a transformation, not a sudden becoming. It was a gradual shift, like a room brightening when a curtain is pulled back a few inches at a time. Tomas, too, carried the studio's lessons beyond the stairway. At work, he found himself pausing before answering colleagues, listening more carefully to what they asked, rather than what he assumed they wanted. He noticed how often he had tried to anticipate needs, to manage outcomes, as if control could prevent loss. In Tango, he learned that forcing a step only created resistance. A clear proposal, delivered with patience, invited a response that felt alive. This realization did not make him carefree, but it made him less rigid. He began to understand that respect was not only kindness, it was a method. It had structure. It had timing. It had the quiet dignity of allowing another person to remain fully themselves. In class, Valeria introduced partner changes as a steady ritual, and at first, Lucia had disliked it. The instinct to attach, to cling to what felt familiar, rose quietly within her. Yet the rotation was always gentle, never abrupt, and over time she discovered its deeper purpose. Each new partner became a new lesson in distance. Some people stepped too close, carrying a longing that wanted to merge. Others held themselves too far away, their arms stiff as if bracing against touch. With each pairing, Lucia learned to adjust without disappearing. She learned to soften her arms without dissolving. She learned that her comfort mattered, and that she could communicate discomfort, not with confrontation, but with posture, with a small recalibration of the frame, with the clear steadiness of her axis. The mirrors helped, though not in the way mirrors usually do. They were not for vanity. They were for awareness. Lucia watched her own reflection and noticed how her face changed when someone crowded her space, how her eyes widened slightly, how her mouth tightened in a polite smile that was not kindness, but defense. She also noticed the opposite. When a partner was respectful, her expression softened, her breathing deepened, her movements grew smoother. These observations did not come with judgment. They came with information, and information felt empowering. She began to understand herself as a body with signals, not a mind trapped in old stories. Tomas used the mirrors differently. He watched his hands, noting how they tended to grip when he felt uncertain, how his shoulders rose when he feared he was not leading well. Valeria would pass behind him and tap his shoulder lightly, reminding him to release tension, to let the weight fall into the floor. "If you hold your own fear," she murmured once, "you won't put it into the other person's body." The sentence stayed with him. He had spent so long trying to keep fear from existing that he had never considered he could simply hold it, acknowledge it, and still move forward gently. One evening, after several partner rotations, Lucia and Tomas found themselves paired again. The familiarity of their connection felt like a calm corner in a room full of shifting angles. They settled into frame with minimal adjustment now, their bodies remembering each other's rhythm. Tomas's hand rested on Lucia's shoulder blade with a supportive lightness. Lucia's hand on his shoulder was steady but not heavy. Their joined hands formed a quiet bridge, and the space between their chests felt intentional, neither cold nor invasive. Valeria watched them briefly, then moved on without comment, as if satisfied that their distance was being practiced with care. They walked through the basic steps, forward and back, pausing with the music's breath. Then Valeria introduced a simple turn, slow and measured, a small spiral that required trust and attentiveness. Tomas proposed the turn with a gentle shift. Lucia followed, translating his invitation into her own movement. The turn was not dramatic. It was a quiet change of direction, like a thought being reconsidered. When they completed it, Lucia felt a small thrill, not excitement, but recognition. She had trusted a movement without needing to know the outcome in advance. Tomas felt something similar. He had guided without forcing, and the result had been smooth, mutual, alive. During a break, Valeria invited the class to sit along the wall and drink water. The room's energy changed from practice to rest, and the students' faces looked softer, less guarded. Lucia sat on her usual chair, her handbag at her feet, and Tomas sat a few chairs away. They did not speak immediately. Silence between them did not feel awkward. It felt like a shared respect for the calm they were building. Yet as the minutes passed, Lucia felt a small curiosity rise, a gentle question that did not demand to be answered, but wanted to exist. Tomas seemed to sense it too. He turned his head slightly toward her, and his voice, when he spoke, was quiet enough to match the room. "You move with care," he said, not as flattery, but as observation. "It's steady." Lucia held his gaze for a moment. Compliments had always made her wary, as if they were hooks. This did not feel like a hook. It felt like a fact offered without expectation. "I'm trying," she replied. Her voice was soft, almost neutral, yet within it, there was a small honesty she had not intended to reveal. "I don't like rushing." Tomas nodded, as if he understood something beyond the words. "Neither do I," he said. He paused, as if choosing his next sentence with the same care he used to propose a step. "I used to think if you didn't rush, you lost your chance. But here, it's different." Lucia looked down at her hands, noticing how they rested relaxed on her lap. "Here," she said, "it feels like you're allowed to stop." The statement surprised her as she spoke it, because it was true not only about tango, it was true about something deeper. Allowed to stop, allowed to breathe, allowed to exist without performing. Tomas's expression softened, his eyes reflecting the warm studio light. "Yes," he said simply, and the word felt like agreement rather than conclusion. They sat in that shared understanding. The pause between them, like the pause in the music. Not empty, but full of listening. Around them, the other students murmured softly, exchanging small observations, laughing in low voices, as if laughter itself had to be treated gently in this room. Valeria watched them with a quiet satisfaction, as though she were tending a garden, and had noticed two plants beginning to grow toward the same light. When class resumed, Valeria introduced an exercise in distance. "You will practice coming closer," she said, "and then returning to space. Not as punishment, not as reward, simply as movement." She demonstrated with a student, showing how the embrace could tighten slightly, then loosen, as if the dance itself were breathing. Closeness, she reminded them, is not a constant. It is a choice you renew. Lucia felt the truth of this in her body as she danced with Tomas again. They practiced a closer frame for a few steps, then eased back into a more open embrace. The change was subtle but meaningful. In the closer moments, Lucia felt Tomas's warmth more clearly, and she noticed her own instinct to either stiffen or surrender. Instead, she stayed present, allowing closeness without losing her own center. When they returned to space, she did not feel abandoned. She felt balanced. Tomas, in turn, learned that easing back did not mean rejection. It meant respect. It meant allowing Lucia to remain comfortable and whole. The mirror reflected them as they moved, and Lucia noticed something quiet and beautiful. Their distance was not a gap filled with longing. It was a space filled with consent. Tomas noticed it too, though he did not name it. He felt it as an ease in his chest, a gentle steadiness that made him less afraid of the dance's pauses. The studio became a place where boundaries were not cold lines. They were warm agreements, shaping the dance the way riverbanks shape water into a calm, clear flow. When the evening ended, Valeria offered a final reminder. "Take what you learn here," she said, her voice soft as the lamp's glow, "and carry it gently. You do not need to change everything at once. You only need to notice when you are rushing past yourself. Notice, then breathe, then choose." She gave them a small smile, and the class bowed their heads slightly in acknowledgement, as if receiving a blessing without calling it one. Lucia descended the stairs into the night, feeling the echo of practiced distance in her bones. The city's air was cooler now, the streets lit in warm pools, the café below humming softly. Tomas followed a few minutes later, stepping into the same night with the same quiet presence. They walked in different directions, yet each carried the same lesson like a small lantern. Romance, if it was to be lasting, could not be a storm that swept away boundaries. It had to be something steadier, something that honored the space between two people and treated that space not as emptiness, but as a home for respect. By the time the next class arrived, the tango studio above the cafe had begun to feel less like an unfamiliar room and more like a small world with its own weather. Outside, Buenos Aires continued to glow and murmur, but inside the studio the air held a special hush, scented faintly with lavender and warmed by the polished wood that seemed to drink in the light and give it back softly. Lucia noticed that she had begun to anticipate this hush during her day, as if her body were learning to crave gentleness the way it once craved certainty. she still told herself she was here to forget, and she believed it, in the sober, practical way one believes in necessity. Yet forgetting, she was discovering, did not feel like erasing a name from paper. It felt like loosening a knot that had tightened in the chest, thread by thread, until breath could move more freely. Tomas arrived with the same steady quiet, yet there was a small change in him as well, something like a door unlatched. He no longer stood as if bracing for impact. He no longer looked at the mirrors as though checking for proof of his existence. Instead, he seemed to settle into the room with a measured ease, his shoulders dropping naturally as soon as he crossed the threshold. He had not forgotten what he had lost. He did not pretend that grief could be instructed away. But in Valeria's studio, he had begun to remember a simpler truth, that he could be present with another person without immediately fearing the end. The end would come in its own time, like nightfall. For now, there was music, and there was breath, and there were the quiet agreements of practiced distance. Valeria began class that evening with a short exercise in listening. She asked them to stand in pairs without moving, to hold the frame lightly and simply breathe together, letting the inhale and exhale become synchronized without forcing it. "You cannot rush harmony," she murmured. "You can only invite it." Lucia found herself paired with Thomas again, and their shared stillness felt less like a test and more like a calm ritual. She sensed the rhythm of his breathing through the frame, a subtle rise and fall that was steady, unshowy. Tomas felt Lucia's breath too, quieter than his but precise, as if she had learned to ration it and was now slowly allowing it to become more generous. In the mirror, they looked like two people standing close in a way that did not consume either of them. When the music began, Valeria guided them through a sequence that was slightly more complex than before. A slow walk, a pause, a gentle pivot, then a return to the walk. The movement demanded attentiveness, and attentiveness had become the studio's true language. Lucia stepped back and to the side, then turned in response to Tomas's proposal, her body translating his invitation into her own smooth arc. Tomas proposed with quiet clarity, careful not to over-direct, careful to keep the conversation alive, rather than turning it into an instruction. Their steps were still simple, still meant for practice, but something in them had softened. They were beginning to trust the shape they made together. Valeria rotated partners midway through, and the familiar pattern of meeting and parting began again. Lucia danced with a man whose hands were too eager, and she practiced holding her frame without hardening, letting the boundary speak for her. She danced with a woman whose gaze kept dropping, as if ashamed to take space, and Lucia found herself offering steadiness through posture alone. Tomas danced with a young follower who anticipated every step, moving ahead of his proposals as if trying to prove something. Valeria corrected them gently. "Wait," she said, and the word was not a reprimand. It was a lullaby syllable. Tomas learned again that patience was not delay. It was respect. When the class reached its break, the air shifted into a softer ease. Students sat along the wall, sipping water or tea that Valeria kept in a large, comforting kettle near the record player. The tea smelled of chamomile and lemon peel, a fragrance that seemed designed to slow the heartbeat. Lucia poured a cup and held it between her hands, letting the warmth seep into her palms. She was aware of Tomas nearby, not as a pressure, but as a presence. In the past, being aware of a man's presence had often meant bracing for some expectation. Here, it felt different. Here, awareness did not automatically lead to obligation. Tomas approached the tea table at the same time, pouring himself a cup with slow care. For a moment, They stood beside each other without speaking, listening to the murmur of the other students and the soft creak of chairs. The windows were dim now, the curtains holding back the city's night. The studio lamps cast a mellow glow that made every face look gentler than it might in daylight. Tomas glanced toward Lucia, and his expression carried the same quiet steadiness he brought to the dance. "Chamomile," he said, more as observation than suggestion. Lucia nodded, a small smile appearing almost against her will. "It tastes like forgiveness," she replied, surprising herself with the phrase. Perhaps it was because the room invited honesty in small doses, the way a careful teacher invites a shy student to speak. Perhaps it was simply the tea's warmth loosening her defenses. Tomas's eyes softened. "Yes," he said, "like something you can accept without earning." Lucia looked down at her cup, letting the steam rise into her face. She felt, in the quiet between them, the gentle pull of curiosity again. It was not longing, not yet. It was simply the desire to know the shape of another person's story, the way one might want to know where a river begins. Curiosity had always seemed dangerous to her, a doorway that led to attachment. Yet here, in this soft-lit studio, curiosity felt less like risk and more like a natural human motion, like turning one's head toward music. Tomas spoke again, his voice low enough to match the room. "We never properly introduced ourselves," he said, and the sentence carried no pressure, only invitation. Lucia felt her pulse quicken, but the feeling was gentle, like a candle being lit. "No," she agreed softly. He held her gaze with calm respect. "I'm Tomas," he said. He did not extend his hand. They had already held hands many times. He simply offered his name as one offers a small object, placed carefully on a table. Lucia let the name settle in her mind. Tomas. It sounded steady, unadorned, like a wooden chair that does not wobble. She realized, with a quiet start, how rarely she had allowed names to feel meaningful in recent months. Names had become reminders of pain, each one a hook. She had tried to live without hooks, yet perhaps not all names were meant to catch and pull. Perhaps some names were simply knots, soft, small ties that connected without tightening. "I'm Lucia," she said, and her own name felt strange on her tongue, as if she were hearing it again after a long silence. Lucia. Light. She had been named for light, and yet she had lived lately as though dimness was safer. Saying her name aloud in this room felt like opening a curtain a little further. Tomas nodded, as if honoring it. "Lucia," he repeated once, quietly, not to claim the name but to acknowledge it. The way he said it made it feel like something gentle, not something that would be used against her. They sipped their tea in silence for a few moments, and the silence was comfortable. Around them, the other students spoke in low voices, some laughing softly. Valeria moved among them with a calm presence, refilling cups, adjusting a curtain, tidying a stack of records. Everything in the room suggested care, as though the studio itself had been designed to teach that tenderness could be practical. Lucia glanced at Tomas, then away, then back again, as if practicing the rhythm of attention without becoming trapped in it. "You said earlier," she began, choosing her words with the same care she used in dance, "that you don't like rushing." Tomas's gaze remained steady. "I used to rush," he admitted. "I thought it was the only way to keep something from slipping away." He paused, and Lucia sensed the weight of memory behind his calm tone. "Now, I'm trying to learn how to stay in a moment without gripping it." Lucia's fingers tightened slightly around her cup, then relaxed. "I came here to forget," she said, the words leaving her mouth before she could reconsider. Once spoken, they felt true in a way that was both painful and relieving. Thomas did not ask what she wanted to forget. He did not lean in with curiosity that demanded satisfaction. He simply nodded, as though accepting the statement as it was, complete. "I came here to remember," he said quietly. The contrast between their reasons hung in the air like two notes of the same chord. Forget. Remember. Lucia felt something shift inside her, not in fear, but in recognition. She did not know what Tomas wanted to remember, and he did not know what she wanted to forget. Yet the honesty of those simple verbs created a small bridge between them. It was not a bridge of romance. It was a bridge of shared humanity, the acknowledgement that both forgetting and remembering were forms of survival. Valeria's voice called them back to practice, soft but clear. "Come," she said. "Let the tea settle. Let the body speak again." They returned to the floor with the group, placing their cups down as if setting aside small confidences. The music began again, and Valeria guided them through the evening's final exercises. Lucia and Tomas were paired once more, and now their connection carried the faint new thread of their names, as though the dance had gained a subtle color. When Tomas proposed a step, Lucia responded with a steadiness that felt more personal, not because she owed him anything, but because she recognized him. Tomas led with the same careful respect, yet now he was more aware of her as Lucia, not simply as partner. The recognition did not make the dance heavier. It made it warmer. As they moved, Lucia felt the old fear of attachment stir faintly, like a distant echo. She did not push it away. Valeria had taught her not to deny what existed in the body. Instead, she acknowledged it and returned to her axis, to her breath, to the practiced boundary of the frame. She could feel connection without collapsing into it. She could let another person's presence be real without letting it become a storm. This, she realized, was a new kind of strength, quiet, steady, sustainable. When class ended, the students gathered their belongings with unhurried movements, as if everyone had learned to leave the room gently. Tomas and Lucia lingered near the door for a moment, not blocking anyone, simply existing in the same small space. The city's night waited beyond the frosted glass, cool and dark and full of streetlights. Tomas glanced at Lucia, and his voice carried no urgency. "Until tomorrow," he said, not as a promise but as a simple expectation of continuity. Lucia felt the phrase settle in her chest. Continuity. It was not forever. It was not an oath. It was merely tomorrow, a modest future that felt safe to imagine. "Until tomorrow," she replied softly. They descended the stairs separately again, yet as Lucia stepped out onto the sidewalk, she realized she was carrying his name with her, like a small, soft knot tied to the evening. It did not pull her. It did not trap her. It simply connected one quiet moment to the next. And for the first time in a long while, Lucia wondered if forgetting might not mean cutting all threads. Perhaps it could mean choosing which threads to keep and tying them gently so they did not tighten into pain. A rain began the next evening, not suddenly, not with drama, but with the soft patience of something that had been thinking about arriving all day. It started as a fine mist that turned the streetlights into halos, then became a gentle, steady fall that made the city shine. Buenos Aires, already fond of twilight, seemed to welcome the rain as another layer of softness. Umbrellas bloomed along the sidewalks like dark flowers. The cobblestones in older neighborhoods held little pools of water that reflected windows and passing faces. Even the usual traffic noise was muted, as if the rain had draped a blanket over the city's busy mouth. Lucia walked carefully, her coat buttoned to the collar, her hair pinned as always, but a few damp strands still escaped near her temples. She did not mind. The rain felt cleansing in a quiet way, as though the air itself were rinsing something tired from her skin. Tomas arrived under the same rain, his steps measured, his shoulders slightly hunched against the coolness. He carried no umbrella, perhaps forgetting it, or perhaps choosing to let the rain touch him without resistance. His hair was slightly darkened by moisture, and the collar of his shirt showed faint specks of water. Yet his face remained calm, as if the weather were simply another kind of music, another rhythm to move within. When he climbed the stairs beside the café, the creaking steps sounded softer than usual, their wood dampened by the evening's humidity. Above, the Tango studio's warm light shone through frosted glass like a small hearth. Inside, the room held a special intimacy. The rain had cooled the air, and Valeria had lit an extra lamp, making the studio glow as though it were wrapped in amber. The curtains along the windows were drawn more tightly, creating a cocoon of warmth, and the scent of chamomile tea was stronger than before. Students arrived with damp coats and softened expressions, grateful for shelter. They shook rain from their sleeves, tucked umbrellas into corners, and settled into the room with the quiet relief of people stepping out of weather and into steadiness. Lucia felt her shoulders drop the moment she crossed the threshold. Tomas did as well. In this room, the rain became background, a gentle percussion beyond the walls. Valeria greeted them with her calm nod, then went to the record player. She chose a record with unusual care, sliding it from its sleeve as if handling something fragile and beloved. When the needle touched down, the first sound was a soft crackle. Then a bandoneon voice emerged, low, rounded, and slow, as if the instrument were speaking in a language older than longing. The piano entered with spaced notes, each one allowed to ring and fade before the next arrived. It was tango, yes, but it was not tango that demanded drama. It was tango that offered room. It was music that did not grab the listener by the collar. It waited to be met. "Listen," Valeria said, and her voice was almost the same volume as the rain outside. "This is music that does not demand you. It does not insist you perform. It does not punish you for being tired. Let it hold you the way a warm room holds someone who has been out in the rain." She looked at the group, her eyes gentle. "Tonight, we will practice the pause, and we will practice the rest. In tango, the rests are not empty. They are where the dance learns to breathe." Lucia felt her chest loosen at the word rest. She had not known how exhausted she was until she heard permission offered. Rest was not something she had been good at. Even in sleep, her mind had remained alert, scanning old memories, rehearsing old conversations, as if vigilance might prevent pain from returning. Tomas, too, felt something soften. He had spent years treating rest as a luxury, something earned only after tasks were complete. Yet his tasks, he had learned, were never truly complete. There was always more to manage, more to plan, more to control. Here, in Valeria's studio, rest was presented as part of the rhythm, not a reward, not a weakness. Valeria asked them to begin with walking again, but slower than before, as if each step were a word spoken carefully. She rotated partners quickly at first, letting everyone warm into the room, then settled Lucia and Tomas together for the main exercise. Their hands met with the familiar gentleness that had become almost a ritual. Lucia's frame found its shape with less effort now. Tomas's posture settled into attentive steadiness. The space between them felt calm, not awkward, as though it had been measured by something wiser than impatience. "Now," Valeria instructed, "step forward and step back, but make the pause longer than you think it should be." She demonstrated, moving with a student in the center. Her feet glided, then stopped, and in the stop, her whole body remained alive, breathing, listening, deciding. "Do not fill the silence," she said softly. "Do not rush to prove you are still connected. In the pause, connection becomes clearer." Thomas proposed the first step with a gentle shift of weight. Lucia stepped back smoothly, her heel whispering against the wood. Then they paused. The music held a note, the bandoneon stretching it like silk, and the pause felt not like stopping but like floating. Lucia felt the warmth of Tomas's hand on her shoulder blade, steady and light. Tomas felt Lucia's balance, her quiet readiness to respond without anticipating. They remained still for a breath, then for another. The world did not collapse. The connection did not vanish. The pause held them like a cradle. They moved again, one slow step, then another pause. The pauses grew more comfortable, less like something to endure and more like something to inhabit. Lucia noticed that in the pause she could feel herself more clearly. She could sense her own center, her own breath, her own boundaries. She could also sense Tomas without feeling swallowed by his presence. Tomas noticed that in the pause he could listen without panic. He did not have to fill the moment with direction. He could wait and still remain responsible. Waiting, he realized, was a form of leadership too. Valeria moved around the room, her shoes making almost no sound. She placed a hand on a student's shoulder, adjusted another's elbow, nodded at someone who had finally softened their jaw. When she passed near Lucia and Tomas, she paused briefly and watched their pause, their stillness, the quiet mutual agreement that existed between their bodies. "Good," she murmured, and the word felt like a warm hand placed gently over a worried heart. As the exercise continued, Valeria introduced a new idea. "Sometimes," she said, "the music asks you to do less. Many people fear doing less. They fear it means they are boring, or unworthy, or forgotten. But the music is wise. It knows that stillness can be more intimate than motion." Her gaze swept the room. "If you have ever felt you must perform to be loved, tonight is for you. If you have ever felt you must chase to be chosen, tonight is for you. Here, you will practice being present without proving." Lucia felt those words land deep. Perform to be loved. It was not exactly her story, yet it touched something familiar. She had performed in a quieter way, by being agreeable, by being accommodating, by smiling when she wanted to speak. She had believed that if she was easy enough to love, she would not be left. Yet being easy, she had learned, often meant being invisible. Tomas felt the other phrase strike him. Chase to be chosen. Yes, he had chased reassurance, chased clarity, chased promises that would guarantee safety. But guarantees had never truly calmed him. They had only tightened his grip, his fear. The rain outside continued, steady as breath. It made the world beyond the curtains feel far away, softened. Inside, the bandoneon sang slowly, and the class moved in a pattern of gentle steps and long pauses. Lucia began to notice how the music itself seemed to teach boundaries. A phrase rose, then ended, leaving space. The space was not an absence. It was part of the melody. The silence between notes was what allowed the notes to feel meaningful. Lucia felt her mind quieting as she listened. The music did not demand her to become someone else. It did not insist she be passionate, or fearless, or joyful. It simply offered itself and asked her to meet it with honesty, Tomas felt something similar. He realized that much of his life had been shaped by demanding music, deadlines, expectations, inner voices that insisted he must always do more. This tango, in Valeria's studio, was different. It was a conversation, yes, but it was also a kindness. It allowed him to step forward and then stop, to propose and then wait, to breathe without feeling he was losing ground. The realization was quietly profound. He did not name it as healing. He simply let it be what it was, a soft change in the way his chest held air. Near the end of the class, Valeria gathered them in a loose circle and asked them to close their eyes for a moment. "Listen," she said again, and now her voice seemed to blend with the rain's hush. "Let the music remind you that love is not a constant demand. Love that demands your anxiety is not love. Love that demands your shrinking is not love. Love that asks you to breathe. This is closer to what we seek." She did not speak the words as doctrine. She spoke them as a gentle possibility. Lucia's eyes remained closed, and in the dark behind her eyelids, she felt the warmth of the room, the faint scent of chamomile, the sound of the bandoneon's slow sigh. She imagined love not as a storm, not as a courtroom where she had to plead, but as this: a room lit softly, a hand offered without pressure, a pause that did not threaten abandonment. Tomas, standing nearby, eyes closed as well, imagined love not as something he had to secure with constant vigilance, but as something that could breathe, expand, contract, and still remain. When Valeria dismissed them, the students opened their eyes slowly, as though waking from a calm dream. They collected their coats, their umbrellas, their belongings. Lucia wrapped her scarf around her neck and felt, for once, that the world outside did not seem so harsh. Tomas put on his jacket and glanced at the windows, where rain traced faint paths down the glass. They exchanged a quiet look, an acknowledgement of shared practice, shared stillness. Neither spoke. Words were not needed. The music had said enough. Downstairs, the cafe's warmth rose to meet them. The smell of coffee mingled with wet pavement and the sweetness of baked bread. Outside, the rain continued, soft and steady, turning the city into a shimmering lullaby of light and water. Lucia stepped into it and felt the drops on her cheeks like cool kisses. Tomas stepped out behind her, the streetlights reflecting in the wet ground like scattered stars. They walked in different directions again, yet both carried the same quiet lesson home. Not all music demands. Some music invites. Some music holds space. And in that space, a person can learn to rest, to pause, and to believe, if only for a moment, that love, too, might be something that does not demand, but simply offers a gentle rhythm and waits for a willing answer. The rain passed in the night, leaving the city rinsed and quiet, as if Buenos Aires had been polished gently while everyone slept. Morning arrived with a thin, silvery light that made the rooftops shine, and by afternoon, the streets had dried into a clean warmth. The air carried a softened freshness, and the leaves on the trees along the avenues looked newly alive. Lucia noticed these small changes on her way to work, the way a person notices subtle shifts in a familiar room after it has been aired out. She felt, too, a similar freshness inside herself, not happiness, not certainty, but a slight clearing, as though some inner window had been opened. She still thought of forgetting as her purpose, yet she was beginning to understand that forgetting might not be a single act. It might be a practice, like tango, made of repeating gentle choices until they became natural. Tomas moved through his day with the same quiet attentiveness, noticing how his body held tension less tightly than before. He caught himself pausing at moments where he would normally push forward, before answering a colleague, before making a decision, before filling a silence with explanations. The pause no longer felt like danger. It felt like an option. In his mind, the bandoneon from the previous night still lingered, slow and patient, and he found himself returning to that imagined sound as if it were a hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He had come to the studio to remember, and he was beginning to sense what that meant. It meant remembering how to live without constant bracing. It meant remembering that he could lead his own life without gripping it. That evening, the Tango studio welcomed them again with its familiar glow. The wooden floor reflected lamplight in long, warm streaks. The curtains softened the outside world into a gentle blur. The kettle near the record player breathed out its chamomile scent. Students arrived in quiet succession, their movements a little less cautious now, their faces slightly more open. Lucia noticed the way some people began to greet each other with small nods, the earliest form of community. Tomas noticed it too. No one spoke loudly. No one performed friendliness. Yet a shared tenderness had begun to form, the kind that grows when people practice respect together. Valeria entered with a small bundle of records under her arm and placed them carefully beside the record player. She looked at the group as if she could see their week, the way their bodies had learned to rest in pauses. Then she spoke, and her voice held a particular clarity. "Tonight," she said, "we learn the stop." She paused, letting the word settle with its quiet weight. Not the stop of failure, not the stop of fear, the stop of boundaries. A faint shifting moved through the students, a ripple of attention. The word boundary carried history for many of them, Lucia suspected. Boundaries were what they had not known how to hold. Boundaries were what others had ignored. Boundaries were what, in certain kinds of love, had been treated as betrayal. Lucia felt a small tightening in her chest. Tomas felt his shoulders rise slightly, as if his body remembered the tension of being told no. Valeria, sensing this, softened her gaze and continued. "Boundaries," she said, "are not walls. They are agreements. They are how we keep tenderness from becoming hunger." She walked toward the center of the room and demonstrated with one of the students, a man who looked nervous but willing. They took frame, and Valeria led him through a few steps, then stopped the dance with a clear stillness that made the air itself feel instructed. Her body remained open, her face calm. The stop was neither harsh nor apologetic. It was simply a stop. "Do you feel that?" she asked the class, still holding frame. Nothing broke, nothing collapsed. We stopped and we stayed connected. This is the lesson. You can say not farther without punishing. You can receive not farther without shame. She released her partner gently and turned back to the group. If you cannot stop kindly, you will keep moving past comfort. If you cannot accept a stop kindly, you will make comfort feel like rejection. Tonight, we practice both. Lucia listened as if Valeria were speaking to some private part of her that had long been ignored. You can say, "not farther." The phrase felt both simple and revolutionary. Lucia had said no in her life, of course, but often it had come with guilt, with explanations, with the need to soften it into something that sounded like yes. Here, Valeria was proposing a different way, a no that was calm, clean, and still connected. Lucia felt the possibility of it like a small lamp turning on in a dark room. Tomas listened, and a different truth stirred in him. Accept a stop kindly. He had always wanted to believe he accepted no, but he had often treated no as something to negotiate. He had not been cruel. He had been anxious. Anxiety, he realized, could be a kind of pressure. It could turn another person's boundary into a problem to solve rather than a truth to respect. Valeria's instruction offered him a way out of that pattern. A stop could be honored. A stop could be a sign of trust, not rejection. Valeria began by pairing the students and guiding them through a slow sequence with built-in stops. Leader proposes, she said. Follower responds. Then we stop together. In the stop, you both breathe. You both check in. Then you continue. Or you don't. She emphasized the final words gently, as if they were the most important. Continuing is not the only success. Sometimes stopping is the success. Lucia found herself paired with Tomas again. Their hands met with that familiar, careful warmth. Lucia's frame settled. Tomas's posture softened. They began the sequence. A step, then stop. In the stop, Tomas kept his hands steady but light, not pulling her forward, not holding her back. Lucia remained present, her body quiet but alive. She could feel her own breath, and she could feel his. The pause was long enough to notice discomfort if it existed, long enough to allow choice. On the next repetition, Valeria instructed the followers to initiate the stop. Followers, she said, you are not passive. You can speak through your body. When you feel the edge of comfort, you stop. You hold your frame. You say, without words, not farther. She demonstrated with a student, showing how the followers' grounded stillness could halt the dance without aggression. Lucia felt her heartbeat quicken. She understood the instruction intellectually, but her body hesitated. Stopping felt risky. Stopping felt like causing trouble. Yet Valeria's calm made it feel possible. Tomas proposed the next step forward, gentle as always. Lucia followed for one step, then another, and then, very softly. She stopped. She did not jerk away. She did not apologize. She simply held her axis and kept her frame steady. The stop was almost invisible, yet it was firm. Tomas felt it immediately. The conversation in their bodies changed. The forward motion met a clear boundary. For a split second, an old reflex rose in him. The desire to push through, to correct, to continue. But Valeria's words were present in his mind like a steady hand. Accept a stop kindly. He exhaled and stopped too, allowing the stillness to settle between them without tension. He did not pull away. He did not question. He simply stayed connected and still. Lucia felt a wave of relief so quiet it almost resembled tenderness. She had stopped, and the world had not punished her. The dance had not collapsed. Tomas had not frowned. He had not tightened his grip. He had stopped with her, as if saying, I heard you. I respect you. Lucia's throat tightened with something that was not sadness, not exactly. It was the sensation of being safe in a way she had forgotten was possible. Valeria approached them and watched their stillness. Her eyes warmed. Yes, she murmured. That is it. A boundary that does not break the connection. She looked at Tomas next. And you, she added softly, received it. Good. Receiving a boundary is an art. It is how love stays clean. They continued practicing, building the stop into different sequences. Sometimes the leader initiated it, pausing to check in. Sometimes the follower did. Sometimes Valeria instructed them to stop unexpectedly, mid-step, and simply breathe. Each time, the stop became less frightening and more familiar. Lucia began to feel how boundaries could create trust rather than distance. Tomas began to feel how honoring boundaries could create warmth rather than loss. During a break, Lucia poured herself tea, her hands steady. Tomas stood nearby, and though neither of them spoke much, their shared silence felt companionable. Lucia glanced at him over the rim of her cup. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how stopping can feel kinder than continuing." Tomas nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Because it's honest," he replied. "Continuing when someone wants to stop is a kind of loneliness. You're moving, but you're not together." He paused, then added gently, "Stopping together feels more like being on the same side." Lucia let the words settle. On the same side. She realized how often, in her past love, she had felt as if she and her partner were on opposite sides of an invisible negotiation. Needs and boundaries had been treated like arguments to win. Here, Valeria was teaching them something different. The dance was not a contest. It was a collaboration. Stopping was not defeat. It was alignment. When practice resumed, the studio felt even calmer, as if the lesson itself had soothed the room. The music Valeria chose was slow and spacious, leaving room for the stops to feel natural. The bandoneon's sighs seemed to approve of stillness. Lucia and Tomas moved through the sequence with a growing ease. When Lucia stopped, Tomas stopped. When Tomas stopped, Lucia stayed connected. Each stop was a quiet promise. "I will not cross you. I will not punish you for having an edge." At the end of the class, Valeria gathered them again. She looked around at their faces, now softer, more thoughtful. "Remember," she said, her voice low and steady, "boundaries are not a lack of romance. They are what keeps romance from burning out. A fire without a hearth becomes a wildfire. A fire with a hearth becomes warmth." She let the metaphor rest. Go home with that. Let it settle in your body. Let it teach your heart what your mind may still resist. Lucia left the studio with the phrase repeating quietly inside her. A fire with a hearth. She walked down the stairs into the night, feeling the city's cool air on her cheeks, and realized that for the first time in a long while, her own boundaries did not feel like loneliness. They felt like a home she could return to. Tomas followed a few minutes later, stepping into the same night with a steadier chest. He had practiced receiving a stop witut shame. He had practiced honoring a line without resentment. And as Buenos Aires glowed around them, patient and warm, both of them carried the same calm understanding. Romance that lasts is not romance that consumes. It is romance with clear edges where two people can step close, pause, and remain kind. The evening after the boundary lesson arrived with a softness that felt earned. The air was clear, the sky a deepening blue that held a few early stars like quiet punctuation. Buenos Aires, rinsed by recent rain, looked freshly composed, as if the city had been written again in cleaner ink. The café below the studio was lively but not loud, filled with the murmur of conversation and the gentle percussion of cups meeting saucers. Up the narrow stairway, the Tango studio glowed as it always did, warm light behind frosted glass, a calm that began before the door even opened. Yet tonight, when class ended and the students began to gather their belongings, there was an additional atmosphere in the room, a small hush of completion. The lesson had not been only about stopping, it had been about safety. And safety, once tasted, lingers like warmth in the hands. Lucia moved with unhurried care as she collected her handbag. Her mind felt quieter than it had in months, not empty, but less crowded. She did not feel triumphant. She felt settled. The practiced stops and pauses had given her something she could carry beyond the dance floor, the awareness that she could choose closeness without surrendering herself. Tomas, nearby, buttoned his cuffs and folded his practice notes. small scribbles on a paper he kept in his pocket, reminders to breathe, to propose, to listen. The habit of writing these notes had begun as a way to keep his mind anchored. Now it felt like a gentle devotion, a sign that he was taking his own learning seriously. As the last students drifted toward the door, Valeria offered her usual farewell with a soft smile and a simple, grounding phrase: "Walk home gently." It was not instruction only for the feet. It was instruction for the heart. Lucia stepped into the hallway and paused at the top of the stairs, hearing the cafe's warmth below. Tomas was a few paces behind her. They had been leaving separately each night, maintaining the practiced distance that made everything feel safe. Yet tonight, as Lucia began to descend, she sensed him following at the same steady pace, not closing in, not hanging back. They reached the sidewalk within a few seconds of each other, and the night air met them with cool kindness. For a moment, they stood outside the cafe, the striped awning above them casting a shadow that felt like shelter. The streetlights made the pavement shine faintly. A bus passed, humming. A couple walked by holding hands, their conversation too soft to hear. Lucia felt the familiar instinct to nod and go her own way, to keep the pattern unchanged. But another feeling rose quietly beneath that instinct. Curiosity again, and something like ease. She looked at Tomas, and his expression held that same calm attentiveness, as if he were waiting not for permission, but for clarity. "Are you going straight home?" he asked, his voice low, careful. There was no weight in the question, no implied obligation. It was simply an opening. Lucia considered. She had no urgent plans. Her apartment would be quiet, as it always was, filled with the familiar silence she had once sought as protection. Tonight, the silence did not frighten her, but she felt a gentle desire to extend the calm she carried. "Not necessarily," she replied. The honesty surprised her, but it felt good. Clean, not forced. Tomas nodded, as if accepting the answer exactly as it was. "San Telmo isn't far," he said after a moment. "Sometimes I walk there at night. The streets, they feel older, softer." He paused. "If you'd like." Lucia heard the unspoken boundary in his phrasing. "If you'd like, not if you should, not if you must." The invitation was light enough that she could hold it without being pulled. She took a slow breath and felt her own internal check-in, the practiced pause Valeria had taught them. Did she want this? Was she comfortable? Would it feel safe? The answer arrived, gentle and clear. Yes, for tonight. Yes, with boundaries. Yes, with the knowledge that she could stop if she wanted. "I'd like that," she said softly. They began to walk together, not touching, not hurrying, their steps naturally finding a shared rhythm. Buenos Aires at night held a particular kind of beauty, one that did not demand admiration, but offered it quietly. The storefronts along the streets were closing, their lights dimming, yet some windows remained bright with late diners and quiet conversations. The smell of grilled meat drifted from a perilla, mingling with the scent of bread and faint cigarette smoke. Somewhere, a radio played a song behind a half-open window. Lucia listened to the city's soundscape as if it were part of the lesson. Movement and pause, noise and hush, closeness and distance. Tomas walked with his hands in his coat pockets, his posture relaxed. He did not fill the air with talk. He seemed to understand that silence could be companionable rather than empty. Lucia appreciated this more than she could have explained. In her past, silence had often been treated as a problem that needed fixing. Questions asked too quickly, reassurances offered too soon. Tomas let silence remain, as if trusting it. The trust itself felt like a gift. They reached the edge of San Telmo as the neighborhood began to reveal its character. Older buildings with iron balconies, narrow streets that curved slightly as if refusing to be straightened, doorways worn smooth by decades of hands and keys. The streetlights here seemed warmer, their glow reflecting off cobblestones that held the memory of countless footsteps. Lucia felt as though she had stepped into a part of the city that moved at a deeper pace, less concerned with modern urgency. There were fewer cars, more walking, more lingering. A small group of people stood outside a bar, laughing softly. A cat sat on a doorstep, watching the world with calm indifference. As they walked, Tomas spoke quietly, as if his words needed to match the neighborhood's old hush. "I used to come here with my father," he said. "On Sundays, we'd look at antiques, even when we couldn't afford anything. He said it was good to remember that objects can outlast moods." He smiled faintly, not quite nostalgic, more thoughtful. Lucia listened, sensing the gentle vulnerability in the memory. "Do you still look at antiques?" she asked. "Sometimes," Tomas replied. "Not to buy, just to see what has survived." He hesitated, then added, "It reminds me that some things don't disappear just because time passes." Lucia felt the sentence touch something in her. Some things don't disappear. She wondered if that was what Tomas meant by remembering, not clinging to a person, but remembering that tenderness could survive, that trust could be rebuilt. She did not ask yet. She let the thought settle quietly. They passed a small plaza where a musician stood beneath a tree, playing a bandoneon. The sound was soft, carried by the night air like a slow breath. The melody was not showy. It was intimate, as if meant for the stones and the leaves rather than for applause. A few people stood nearby, listening, their faces calm. Lucia and Tomas slowed instinctively, drawn by the music's familiar language. They did not dance. They simply stood side by side, listening. The bandoneon's notes rose and fell, a gentle conversation with the night. Lucia felt the music in her ribs, and with it the echo of Valeria's lessons. Pause, stop, breathe, choose. Tomas's presence beside her felt steady, not pressing. Lucia realized that this too was a form of tango, standing close without claiming, sharing a moment without demanding it become more. When the musician finished, he nodded slightly and began to pack his instrument. The small audience drifted away with quiet respect. Lucia and Tomas resumed their walk, their steps naturally synchronized again. The cobblestones underfoot made their movement slower, encouraging attentiveness. Lucia noticed how her body had begun to carry itself differently, more grounded, less braced. She noticed how Tomas seemed to match her pace without effort, as if the shared rhythm mattered more to him than arriving somewhere quickly. They reached a corner where an antique shop window displayed old clocks, their faces pale and varied, some cracked, some intact. Lucia paused, drawn to the way the clocks looked like attentive eyes. Tomas stopped with her, not impatient, simply present. The clocks, all different, all marking time in their own way, seemed to embody the lesson they were learning. Time could move, and yet stillness could exist within it. Lucia spoke without quite planning to. "This is nice," she said quietly. "Walking without needing anything from the walk." Tomas turned his head toward her, his expression gentle. "Yes," he said. "Just being here is enough." Lucia felt the truth of that sentence settle like warmth in her chest. In her past, she had often felt that being with someone required offering something: cheer, reassurance, agreement, proof of affection. Tonight, She was simply walking, simply breathing, simply existing beside another person who did not demand more. Tomas, for his part, felt something ease in him. He had invited her, and she had come. He did not need to secure the moment with promises. He could let it be what it was, a small, calm connection with clear edges. They turned back toward their respective neighborhoods when the night grew deeper and the streets quieted further. On the way, they spoke a little more. Small observations about the city, about the music, about how cobblestones changed the way one walked. The conversation remained light, yet beneath it flowed something steadier. Mutual respect, the shared practice of boundaries. When they reached the street where their paths would separate, Tomas stopped with the same calm clarity Valeria had taught them, not stepping into Lucia's space, not reaching for her hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for walking." Lucia felt the simplicity of the gratitude like a gentle touch. "Thank you," she replied, and she meant it, not as politeness, but as recognition of how safe the evening had felt. They exchanged a quiet look, an acknowledgement, not a promise, and then Lucia turned and walked toward home. Tomas watched her for a moment, then went his own way. The city around them continued to glow, patient and warm, and the bandoneon's earlier melody lingered faintly in Lucia's mind like a lullaby. She carried it with her up the stairs to her apartment, and as she unlocked her door, she realized she was not entering silence as refuge from pain. She was entering it as rest. The walk through San Telmo had not made her fall in love. It had done something quieter. It had shown her that closeness could be gentle, that companionship could have space, and that the simplest kind of romance might begin not with fireworks, but with two people walking beside each other, letting the night be soft around them. The days that followed their walk through San Telmo carried a subtle afterglow, the way a room holds warmth after a candle has been blown out. Nothing dramatic had changed. Buenos Aires remained itself, busy, luminous, patient. Lucia still went to work, still returned to her apartment where the furniture sat quietly in its familiar places. Tomas still moved through his routines with the discipline of a man who had learned to keep life orderly. Yet something had shifted beneath these ordinary surfaces, something gentle and persistent. It was not infatuation. It was not even certainty. It was simply the knowledge that a calm evening could be shared without cost, and that a connection could exist without immediately tightening into fear. In the studio, Valeria continued to teach as if she were weaving a tapestry, thread by thread, never rushing the pattern. The exercises grew slightly more nuanced, inviting students to feel micro-choices: how much pressure to use in the hand, how long to hold a pause, how to soften without collapsing. Lucia found herself absorbing these lessons with a steadier mind. Her body remembered more quickly now. Her feet began to move with less conscious effort, leaving her awareness free to notice subtlety, the way a partner's breath signaled hesitation, the way a slight change in frame could communicate comfort or discomfort. Tomas, too, grew more fluent in the language of proposals. He learned how to suggest movement without insisting, how to lead by offering clarity rather than force. The studio became a place where their nervous systems learned a new rhythm, attentive, calm, unafraid of pauses. One evening, after class had ended and most students had already left, Valeria lingered near the record player, tidying vinyl sleeves with her usual calm precision. The lamps cast warm pools of light across the floor, and the mirrors reflected a room that looked almost like a dream. Quiet, golden, softened at the edges. Lucia was near the door, fastening her coat, when she noticed Tomas still standing by the window. gazing out through the curtain's thin fabric at the city lights beyond. His posture looked thoughtful, as if he were listening to something inside himself that had not yet found words. Lucia hesitated, then approached slowly, keeping enough distance to make the choice feel mutual. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. The question was simple, offered without pressure, the way a hand might be offered without gripping. Tomas turned toward her, and for a moment she saw something unguarded in his eyes, an old tiredness, and beneath it, a quiet sincerity. "Yes," he said, then paused as if testing the truth of the word. "I think so. It's just, sometimes the quiet after class feels loud." Lucia nodded. She understood. The studio's calm could make a person realize how much noise they carried inside. "Do you want to walk a little?" she asked. The invitation surprised her as she spoke it, but it felt right, and it felt safe. It was a gentle offering, not a request for closeness that demanded a certain kind of answer. Tomas exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that." They descended the stairway together, moving at the same pace. The café below was quieter than usual, the evening crowd thinning, leaving behind the warm scent of coffee and sugar. Outside, the night air was cool and still, the rain's freshness now only a memory. Streetlights cast soft circles on the pavement, and the city's distant sounds felt like a lullaby played from another room. They began to walk without deciding on a destination, letting their feet choose streets that looked calm. For several minutes they said nothing. Their silence was not emptiness. It was the kind of silence that allows a person to gather themselves. Lucia felt the steady rhythm of their footsteps. She noticed how Tomas matched her pace without effort, neither hurrying her nor lagging behind. The respect in this small detail felt significant, though she did not dwell on it. She simply let it warm the evening. After a while, they reached a quieter street lined with trees. Leaves rustled softly overhead. Tomas spoke then, his voice low. "When I said I came to remember," he began, and Lucia sensed the careful weight of the words. "I wasn't trying to sound poetic." He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I meant it literally. There's something in me I've misplaced." Lucia looked at him, her expression calm, inviting him to continue without pulling. "What kind of something?" she asked gently. Tomas walked for a few steps before answering, as if letting the movement help him find the right words. "A version of myself," he said at last. "A person who wasn't always preparing for the worst." He paused, his gaze fixed forward on the soft glow of streetlights. "I used to be lighter, not careless, just able to enjoy things without needing proof that they'd last." Lucia felt a quiet tenderness rise in her chest. She recognized that longing, though her own had a different shape. "What happened?" she asked softly, and then immediately regretted the bluntness. Yet Tomas did not recoil. He seemed relieved by the directness, as if it allowed him to speak without circling. "It wasn't one thing," he said. "It's never one thing, is it?" His tone held no bitterness, only fatigue. "I loved someone for a long time. We were gentle at first. Then life got busy. Then we stopped noticing each other. I tried to hold on tighter, and the tighter I held, the more she slipped away." He swallowed, his throat working quietly. In the end, it wasn't a fight. It was a quiet leaving, like a room emptying without anyone announcing it. Lucia listened, her heart steady. She did not reach for his hand. She did not offer consolation that would make him feel obligated to respond. She simply stayed present, letting her attention be a calm space. Tomas continued, his voice even, as if speaking the memory aloud was a way of smoothing it. After that, he said, I promised myself I would never be caught unaware again. I became vigilant. I checked for signs. I asked for reassurance. I made plans. I thought planning could protect me. He shook his head slightly, a quiet gesture of recognition. But vigilance is exhausting, and it doesn't bring back what it's trying to prevent. They walked in silence for a moment, the night holding them gently. Lucia felt her own breath deepen. She realized she was not feeling the old reflex to fix, to soothe, to make everything better. She was simply listening, and the listening felt like a gift she could offer without losing herself. Tomas reached into his coat pocket then, slowly, as if performing a small ritual. He pulled out a tiny object and held it in his palm. Under the streetlight, it glinted softly. Lucia leaned her gaze toward it without leaning her body too close. The object was a small, worn coin, an old Argentine coin, its surface smoothed by years of being handled. One side bore a faint profile, the other a design nearly rubbed away. My father gave me this, Tomas said quietly, when I was a boy. He said, keep something small that reminds you you've been through change and stayed yourself. He turned the coin between his fingers, the motion slow and thoughtful. After my father died, I carried it more often, and after my relationship ended, I started carrying it every day. He looked at Lucia, his eyes steady. It's not superstition, it's just an anchor. Lucia felt the tenderness in her chest deepen, but it remained calm, not sharp. It looks like it's been held a lot, she said. Tomas nodded. It has. Sometimes I hold it when I'm afraid I'm becoming someone I don't want to be. He paused, his gaze dropping briefly to the coin. The person I want to remember is the one who could love without bargaining. Lucia let the sentence settle, the way Valeria taught them to let a pause settle. Love without bargaining. She thought of how she had bargained in her own way, agreeing, shrinking, accommodating, trading her boundaries for the hope of being chosen. She did not say this yet. Tonight, she sensed, was for Tomas's remembering. You're doing it, she said softly, surprising herself with the simplicity of the statement. You're remembering. Tomas looked at her, and for a moment his expression softened into something almost boyish, a brief glimpse of the lighter self he had described. Maybe, he said, or maybe I'm practicing. Tango feels like practice. It feels like a place where I can learn again without being punished for learning slowly. Lucia nodded. Yes, she agreed. It's patient. They continued walking, turning onto another street where the buildings were lower and the night felt even quieter. A cat crossed their path and disappeared into shadow. The smell of night-blooming flowers drifted from a courtyard somewhere behind a gate. Lucia felt the calm of the evening settle into her bones, and she realized that being with Tomas did not make her feel hunted by expectation. It made her feel like she was standing beside someone who understood the work of healing without calling it that. Tomas slipped the coin back into his pocket, but the gesture had shifted something in the air. The sharing was not dramatic. It did not demand reciprocation, yet it created a deeper layer of trust, like adding a soft blanket to a bed that is already warm. Lucia felt, with quiet clarity, that Tomas was not asking her to carry his sorrow. He was simply letting her witness it. Being allowed to witness, she realized, was a kind of intimacy that did not require surrender. When they reached a corner where their paths would naturally diverge, Tomas stopped with the calm clarity Valeria had taught them. He did not step into Lucia's space. He simply faced her, his expression gentle. "Thank you," he said, and his voice held real gratitude. not obligation. For listening, Lucia felt the words land softly. She did not need to reassure him. She did not need to promise anything. "Thank you," she replied quietly, "for trusting me with it." Tomas nodded once, as if honoring her response. "Good night, Lucia." "Good night, Tomas," she said. They parted with the same practiced distance that had become their quiet protection. Lucia walked home, feeling the city's night air cool against her cheeks, feeling her own breath steady. She thought of Tomas's coin, that small anchor carried in a pocket. She thought of Valeria's lesson that romance lasts when it has a hearth, clear edges, warm boundaries. Perhaps, she considered, remembering and forgetting were not opposites. Perhaps they were two parts of the same gentle work, letting go of what harms, holding on to what steadies. And in the calm rhythm of her steps, Lucia carried the sense that something was being built between them, not quickly, not dramatically, but carefully, like a dance learned one patient pause at a time. After Tomas's quiet confession, the world did not transform. Buenos Aires did not rearrange itself into a kinder city overnight. The river still lay wide and gray-blue beyond the buildings. The buses still sighed at corners. The cafes still filled and emptied in their steady rhythm. Yet Lucia moved through the following days with a new tenderness toward herself, as though Tomas's act of remembering had given her permission to consider her own act of letting go. She had come to the studio to forget, and until now she had treated that purpose like a private vow, something sealed behind her ribs. Listening to Tomas speak so plainly about what he carried, without drama and without demand, had loosened something in her. It suggested that what lived inside could be spoken gently and still remain contained. It suggested that a story could be shared without turning into a storm. In class, Valeria continued to guide them deeper into subtlety. The steps remained simple, yet the attention required grew more refined. There were exercises in weight transfer that felt like lessons in trust, and pivots that taught the body to respond without panic. Valeria spoke often of clarity. "The dance is not built on guessing," she said softly. "It is built on sensing. If you are always guessing, you are not present. If you are present, you will know what to do next." Lucia felt these words as if they were meant not only for tango. She had lived too long in guessing what someone wanted, guessing what mood would arrive, guessing how to avoid displeasure. Presentness, she realized, was not only calm, it was power. One evening, after class ended and the other students drifted out, Lucia lingered near the kettle, pouring herself chamomile tea as the room quieted into its afterglow. The lamps cast a warm softness over the wooden floor, and the mirrors reflected a space that looked almost like a sanctuary. Tomas stood a short distance away, folding his jacket over his arm, waiting without crowding. Valeria, near the record player, turned off the last piece of music and began to stack the vinyls with her calm, practiced care. The silence that followed felt full, not empty, like a pause held deliberately in the dance. Lucia felt a quiet impulse rise, an urge to speak before she lost her courage. She had listened to Tomas. She had held his memory with steadiness. Now she sensed that something inside her wanted to be released, not dramatically, but cleanly, like a breath finally allowed to fully leave the lungs. She turned toward Tomas, keeping a respectful distance, and met his eyes. "Can I tell you something?" she asked softly. Tomas's expression shifted into attentive calm. He did not move closer. He did not lean away. He simply nodded as if making space. "Yes," he said. "Of course." They stepped out of the studio together and into the stairway, where the light was dimmer and the cafe's sounds rose from below like distant water. Lucia paused halfway down the stairs, not blocking anyone, just choosing a spot where the air felt cooler and the quiet felt safer. Tomas stopped a few steps below her, turning slightly so he could see her without towering. The placement itself felt like boundary and respect, a small choreography of care. Lucia held her handbag strap lightly, a gesture that steadied her hands. "I said I came to forget," she began, and her voice sounded calm, though she could feel a tightness in her throat. "I didn't mean forgetting a person entirely. I don't think that's possible." She paused, letting the thought settle. "I meant forgetting the way I became with him." Tomas listened without interruption. His face remained open, his eyes steady. Lucia felt grateful for the absence of urgency. It allowed her to continue in her own pace, the way Valeria allowed pauses in music. "It wasn't violent," Lucia said, as if clarifying for herself. There were no broken plates, no shouting. She gave a small, almost humorless smile. "That's why it took me so long to realize something was wrong. It looked like love from the outside." She swallowed gently, the movement small but deliberate. "He was charming. He was admired. And he wanted me close. Always close. At first it felt like devotion." Tomas's brow softened slightly, not in judgment, but in recognition of something difficult. Lucia continued, her words steady, her tone controlled in a way that felt less like suppression and more like careful handling. "Over time," she said, "being close stopped feeling warm. It started feeling crowded." She searched for the right word, then found it. He would ask for small things, not demands exactly, just expectations. She looked down for a moment, then back up. He wanted to know where I was. He wanted to know what I was thinking. He wanted my time, my attention. And every time I tried to keep something for myself, a quiet afternoon, a dinner with a friend, even a thought I didn't want to explain, he treated it like distance. She felt the old familiar guilt rise as she spoke, like a shadow trying to reclaim its place. Yet she kept her voice calm. She kept her breath steady. She could feel Valeria's lessons in her body. Hold your axis. Do not collapse. Do not harden. Simply stay present. "I began to explain everything," Lucia said softly. "I began to apologize for wanting ordinary things. I started editing myself before I spoke because I didn't want him to feel rejected." She paused, and the pause was thick with memory. "Slowly I became smaller, not physically but inside. I stopped taking up space." Tomas's throat moved as if he were swallowing emotion, but he did not speak. He remained quiet, holding the listening like a steady hand. Lucia exhaled slowly. "When it ended," she continued, "it wasn't because I stopped loving him. It was because I couldn't recognize myself anymore." Her voice softened. "I looked in the mirror and realized I was living like a guest in my own life. Always polite, always careful, always trying to keep the peace." The stairway's dim light made her face look gentler, more vulnerable. The cafe's distant murmur below seemed to fade, as if the world itself was giving her room. Lucia felt the strange relief of telling the truth without being interrupted. The truth did not become heavier by being spoken. In fact, it became lighter, as though words were a way of releasing it from the body's grip. Tomas finally spoke, and when he did, his voice was low, measured. "You didn't shrink because you were weak," he said quietly. "You shrank because you were trying to keep something alive." Lucia felt tears prick her eyes, not as a flood, but as a small, honest response. She blinked slowly, Yes, she whispered. I thought that was what love required. Tomas held her gaze. It's what fear requires, he said gently. Not love. The sentence landed softly, not as a judgment, but as a balm. Lucia felt it settle in her chest like warm tea. Fear requires shrinking. Love does not. She knew, intellectually, that this was true, yet hearing it spoken aloud in such a calm voice made it feel newly possible. Lucia continued, her voice steadier again. I'm trying to forget that version of myself, she said, the one who apologized for existing. She paused, and her shoulders eased downward as if she were physically letting something drop. I don't want to carry that habit into the future. I don't want my body to think closeness always means losing myself. Tomas nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. That makes sense, he said. And Tango is a good place for that. He glanced upward toward the studio's door. Because it teaches closeness with structure, Lucia felt a small, grateful smile form. Yes, she agreed. It teaches me I can step back without being cruel. And stop, Tomas added softly, without being punished. Lucia's smile deepened, not into joy, but into relief. She felt understood in a way that did not require explanation. She felt seen without being claimed. They began walking again, descending the remaining stairs and stepping out onto the sidewalk. The night air met them with cool softness. The streetlights cast warm circles on the pavement, and a faint breeze carried the scent of coffee from the café behind them. They walked slowly, letting the movement settle what had been spoken. Lucia's tears did not fall. They simply remained as a quiet brightness in her eyes, a sign that something had loosened. After a few blocks, Tomas spoke again, his voice gentle. Thank you for telling me, he said, for trusting me with it. Lucia nodded. Thank you for listening, she replied. She hesitated, then added, You didn't try to fix it. Tomas gave a small, almost rueful smile. I'm learning, he said. Fixing is another kind of control. Lucia understood. She had tried to fix too, in her own way, fixing moods, fixing misunderstandings, fixing the fragile peace. Now, walking beside Tomas, she felt the possibility of something different. Presence without repair, attention without possession. They reached the corner where their paths diverged, and as always, they stopped with a gentle clarity. Tomas did not step into Lucia's space. Lucia did not lean into his. The distance between them felt like a boundary that protected what was tender, keeping it from becoming too much, too fast. Good night, Lucia, Tomas said. Good night, Tomas, she replied. Lucia walked home with a strange lightness, as if she had set down a heavy bag she had been carrying for years. She entered her apartment and moved through the rooms with quiet awareness, noticing her own presence, the sound of her steps, the way her hands turned on a lamp, the way her breath moved in her chest. She realized that forgetting, as she had begun to practice it, was not erasing memory. It was releasing the reflex to shrink. It was reclaiming her own space, inch by inch, until she no longer felt like a guest in her own life. And somewhere, in the calm rhythm of her evening, she sensed that what was growing between her and Tomas was not a hungry romance that would demand sacrifice. It was something slower, something steadier, something with edges, a connection that could hold both remembering and forgetting without asking either of them to disappear. As the course neared its final nights, the Tango studio began to feel like a small season that was slowly turning. Nothing in the room had changed. Wooden floor, mirrors, gauzy curtains, the kettle's steady breath of chamomile. But the students moved differently now. Their shoulders were lower. Their hands met with less hesitation. Their pauses looked less like uncertainty and more like choice. Even their silences had become more comfortable, as if each person had learned that quiet did not always mean danger. Valeria watched this progression with the calm satisfaction of someone tending a garden, seeing growth not as a sudden bloom, but as the steady thickening of stems and roots. Lucia noticed the change in herself most clearly in the moments between steps. Her body no longer anticipated harm the way it once had. When a partner's hand rested on her shoulder blade, she felt the touch as information rather than pressure. When the dance paused, she did not rush to fill the space. She let it exist, and in that existence, she could sense her own center with more clarity. Tomas, too, had changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. His leadership had become quieter, more precise. He proposed with gentleness and waited with confidence, as though he had finally learned that waiting was not weakness. In his eyes, Lucia saw less vigilance and more presence, the steadiness of a man beginning to trust the rhythm rather than trying to control it. Valeria's lessons in the final week turned toward improvisation, not as performance, but as attentiveness. "You have learned the alphabet," she said softly one evening, standing near the record player as the students gathered. "Now you will practice speaking." She smiled faintly, and the smile held no promise of perfection. In tango, speaking means responding. It means listening. It means choosing. You will learn the dance of yes and no, not with words, but with timing, breath, and small decisions. She selected a record with a slow, spacious melody, one that left room for the dancers to think. The bandoneon's voice was warm and patient, the piano notes spaced like stepping stones across a calm river. "Improvisation," Valeria continued, "does not mean doing whatever you want. It means being awake to what is happening. It means respecting your partner's comfort. It means knowing when to invite, when to pause, when to stop." Her gaze moved across the room and rested briefly on Lucia and Tomas, as if acknowledging the quiet work they had been doing together. "A good dance," she added, "is not made of constant yes. It is made of clear yes and clear no." The students paired up, and Lucia and Tomas found each other with the ease of familiarity. Their hands met lightly. Their frames settled into its shared shape. The space between them felt like a quiet agreement, renewed each time they came together. Tomas proposed the first movement, a slow walk, and Lucia followed, translating his invitation into her own smooth backward steps. Then, instead of repeating a practiced sequence, Tomas paused, listening to the music's phrasing. He offered a small pivot. Lucia responded. He offered a step to the side. She followed. The dance was no longer a memorized pattern. It was a conversation. At first, the conversation felt tentative, like speaking a new language. Tomas worried he would propose something unclear. Lucia worried she would misread him. Yet Valeria's earlier lessons held them steady. Offer, then listen. Respond, don't anticipate. Pause, check in. Each time uncertainty rose, they returned to the pause, and the pause gave them clarity again. Valeria moved among the couples, observing, correcting gently. When she reached Lucia and Tomas, she watched for a moment, then spoke in a voice low enough that only they could hear. "Tomas," she said, "do not plan 3 steps ahead. Stay here." Then she turned to Lucia. "Lucia, do not follow as a habit. Follow as a choice. If you need to say no, say it." She tapped Lucia's arm lightly, a touch of encouragement. "Your no is part of the dance." Lucia felt the words settle. Her no is part of the dance. She had spent so long treating no as a threat to connection. Yet, Here it was framed as a necessary note in the melody. Tomas, hearing Valeria, felt his own lesson deepen. A leader who planned too far ahead was not listening. He was performing. He inhaled slowly and let his attention rest fully in the present, sensing Lucia's balance, her breath, the subtle way her body responded. They danced again, and this time Tomas offered fewer steps. But each one was clearer. Lucia followed with more intention, noticing the precise moment she chose to respond rather than simply reacting. Then, midway through a pivot, Lucia felt a familiar edge, the point where she might have forced herself to comply even if she was unsure. The room's old reflex whispered, "Keep going, be easy, don't cause trouble." But Valeria's voice lived in her body now, like a calm bell. "Your no is part of the dance." Lucia stopped. It was not abrupt. It was not dramatic. She simply held her axis and let her frame remain steady, signaling a boundary with quiet clarity. Tomas felt the stop immediately. His old reflex, interpret stop as rejection, flared for a heartbeat, then softened. He exhaled, stopped with her, and stayed connected without pressure. In that shared stillness, Lucia felt something profound. She had said no, and Tomas had not punished her for it. Tomas felt something equally profound. He had received no, and it had not diminished him. It had made the dance cleaner, safer, truer. "Thank you," Tomas murmured, almost without thinking. Lucia blinked, surprised. "For what?" she asked softly. "For telling me," he said, "for being clear." Lucia felt warmth spread through her chest, calm and steady. Clarity, she realized, could be a form of kindness. They continued, and Lucia noticed that after she stopped, the dance became even more attentive. Tomas listened more closely. Lucia trusted more deeply. Their yes became more real because it was not automatic. Their no became more gentle because it was respected. The conversation between them grew quieter and more intimate, not through closeness of bodies, but through precision of consent. It was as if they had both agreed, without speaking it aloud, that romance, if it was to exist, would be built on these small, steady agreements, not on hunger or fear. During a break, Valeria poured tea for the students, her movements unhurried. Lucia and Tomas stood near the window, cups warming their hands. The street outside was dark and calm, the city lights blurred through the curtain's thin fabric. In the faint reflection of the window, Lucia could see them standing close but not touching, their posture relaxed, their faces softened by the room's warm glow. "I used to think," Lucia said quietly, "that saying no meant losing someone." Tomas looked at her with gentle seriousness. "I used to think," he replied, "that hearing no meant I wasn't wanted." Lucia nodded slowly, the truth of both statements settling between them. "But here," she said, "no feels like care." Tomas's eyes softened. "Yes," he agreed, "like keeping the dance safe." They sipped their tea in quiet understanding. The chamomile tasted mild and comforting, the lemon peel faint and bright. Lucia felt the warmth of the cup seep into her palms and imagined that warmth spreading inward, loosening old fear. Tomas felt the same warmth and thought of his coin, the small anchor in his pocket. He did not touch it tonight. He did not need to. The anchor was becoming internal, a steadiness built from practice rather than from superstition. When the music began again, Valeria invited the class to dance a final improvisation, longer this time, allowing each couple to find their own rhythm. The room filled with slow movement, gentle pivots, long pauses. It looked like a quiet tide, bodies rising and settling, never colliding, never rushing. Lucia and Tomas moved within this tide with a calm fluency. Tomas proposed a step forward, then paused. Lucia responded, then held still, checking in. Sometimes she stopped, sometimes she softened into a yes. Each choice felt deliberate, and each deliberate choice made their connection feel more real. As the song ended, Valeria lowered the volume and let the silence return. The class slowed, pairs releasing each other with quiet respect. Valeria gathered them near the mirrors and spoke with a voice so soft it almost blended with the room's breath. "You have learned," she said, "that love is not constant motion. Love is not constant yes. Love is a listening. Love is a boundary. Love is knowing when to step closer and when to stop." She looked at them, her eyes kind and steady. "If you remember only one thing, remember this. Romance that lasts is romance that can hear no and stay warm." Lucia felt the words settle like a blanket over her shoulders. She glanced at Tomas, and he met her gaze with calm openness. There was something in that gaze that felt like invitation, but not demand. Lucia felt her heart respond with a gentle yes. Not a yes to a promise, not a yes to a story she could predict, but a yes to the present moment, to the quiet trust they had built. When class ended, they walked down the stairs together again. At the sidewalk, the night air was cool, the streetlights warm. Tomas turned toward Lucia, and for a moment his hand lifted as if to reach for hers, then paused. The pause itself was a question. Lucia felt the question, checked in with herself, and answered with a small, deliberate movement. She extended her hand. Their fingers met lightly, not gripping, just resting together. The touch felt steady, respectful, and full of that practiced truth. Yes can be soft, and no can be kind, and boundaries can hold romance the way a hearth holds fire. They stood like that for a moment, hand in hand beneath the quiet Buenos Aires streetlight, and then, still holding the gentleness of the gesture, they began to walk, slowly, calmly, into the night that waited like a soft cover, ready to fold over the city and keep it safe. The final night of the course arrived without fanfare, as if Buenos Aires had decided that important things did not need to announce themselves loudly. The day had been mild, the sky a clean blue that faded into a gentle violet as evening approached. Streetlights woke one by one along the avenues, and the city's windows began to glow, each one a small, steady lantern. Lucia moved through her afternoon with a quiet awareness that this was an ending, and yet it did not feel like loss. It felt like the last page of a chapter, read slowly, with time to absorb every line. Tomas carried the same awareness, though he did not name it as he walked toward the café corner. He only felt the familiar steadiness in his chest, the calm that had been practiced into him step by step, pause by pause. The stairway beside the café creaked in its friendly way as Lucia climbed, and she noticed how her body no longer tightened at the sound. The creak had become part of the ritual, like the first note of a lullaby. At the top, the blue door stood closed, its frosted glass glowing softly from within. Lucia turned the brass knob and stepped into the studio's warmth. The wooden floor shone as it always did, reflecting the lamps in long, honeyed streaks. The mirrors held the room's quiet, like still water. The curtains softened the windows into pale veils. The kettle's chamomile scent rested in the air, gentle and familiar, as if the studio itself were breathing calm. Students arrived gradually, faces softened by weeks of practice. Some greeted each other with small nods, others with quiet smiles. Their bodies carried less guardedness now. Their hands held less fear. They were still themselves, with their histories and doubts, but those doubts had been given structure, a place to rest. Lucia felt a quiet affection for these strangers, not the affection of intimacy, but the affection of shared work. Tomas felt it too. The subtle bond formed when people learned to be kind in the same room. Valeria entered last, as if letting the students settle first. She wore her dark dress as always, silver hair pinned neatly, her posture calm and centered. She looked around the room with a gaze that held both tenderness and respect, as if she were acknowledging not only their attendance but their courage. "Good evening," Valeria said softly. "Tonight, we do not learn something new. Tonight, we practice what you have already learned." She paused, letting the room's silence become a gentle container. "You have learned to step forward without hunger. You have learned to step back without fear. You have learned to stop without punishment. Now we will dance once, slowly, and we will let the dance be a simple gratitude." She chose a record with care, placing it on the turntable as if placing a candle on a table. The needle touched down, the soft crackle like the sound of a match being struck, and then music rose, warm bandoneon, patient piano, a melody that seemed to inhale and exhale. The tango felt older than the room, older than their doubts, as if it had been waiting for them long before they arrived. Valeria's voice moved through the studio like a gentle thread. "Find your partner," she said, "and remember the rules of kindness." Lucia and Tomas found each other almost immediately, not through urgency, but through ease. Their hands met with the familiarity of something practiced carefully, a touch that held no claim. Lucia felt Tomas's palm warm against hers. Tomas felt Lucia's steady presence, her calm strength. They took frame, and the space between their bodies felt like a home they had built together, not a house of promises, not a castle of fantasy, but a simple dwelling made of respect. Lucia inhaled and felt her own axis. Tomas inhaled and felt his own breath settle. Around them, other couples did the same, the studio becoming a quiet constellation of pairs, each one practicing tenderness with boundaries. The music invited the first step. Tomas proposed with a gentle shift, and Lucia stepped back with calm clarity. Their feet moved slowly, not performing, not impressing, simply speaking. The wooden floor supported them with steady warmth. The mirrors reflected their movement, showing not perfection but attentiveness. The slight pause before a pivot, the softness in Lucia's shoulders, the restraint in Tomas's hand. They moved through the basic walk, forward and back, allowing the pauses to be long enough to feel meaningful. In each pause, Lucia checked in with herself and found that her answer was still yes. Yes to this moment. Yes to this gentle connection that did not ask her to shrink. In each pause, Tomas checked in with himself and found that he did not need to tighten his grip to feel safe. They turned, slowly, in a small pivot that felt like a thought being reconsidered kindly. Tomas did not plan far ahead. He listened to the music's breath and to Lucia's balance. Lucia did not anticipate. She received and translated, trusting the clarity of his proposal and the steadiness of her own body. When the melody grew quieter, they grew quieter too, allowing stillness to enter without fear. When the melody rose, they rose with it, not as drama, but as gentle emphasis. Their dance was not a story of conquest. It was a story of agreement. At one point, Lucia felt the faint edge of fatigue in her calf, a small physical reminder that even gentle things require care. She stopped, softly, holding her axis. Tomas stopped with her immediately, his response calm, respectful. The pause was not a rupture. It was a shared decision. Lucia breathed and the fatigue eased. She nodded slightly, not as apology, but as signal. Tomas listened, then proposed the next step. The dance continued, clean and safe. In that simple exchange, stop, breathe, continue, Lucia felt the entire meaning of the course settle into her bones. Romance that lasts is romance that can stop. Romance that lasts is romance with a hearth. Valeria watched from the edge of the room, her hands folded loosely, her expression serene. She did not intervene. She did not need to. The students were doing the work. The music moved toward its final phrases, the bandoneon stretching a note like a slow sigh. Tomas and Lucia took one last step, then paused together, letting the final note fade into silence. When the record ended, the needle lifted with a soft click, and the studio held a quiet that felt sacred. Not heavy, not sad, but complete. Valeria let the stillness linger. Then she spoke, her voice as gentle as the chamomile scent in the air. "Thank you," she said, "for practicing kindness, for practicing boundaries, for learning that tenderness can be disciplined." She looked around the room, meeting each face with calm warmth. "You do not need grand vows," she continued. "You do not need promises that frighten you. You only need this: the ability to notice, to pause, and to choose." Students began to gather their belongings slowly, as if reluctant to break the spell of calm. There were quiet goodbyes, small smiles, the soft rustle of coats. Lucia and Tomas remained near the window for a moment. The city lights blurred beyond the curtain. They did not rush to define what they were to each other. They had learned, together, that definition could wait, and that waiting did not diminish truth. Tomas looked at Lucia with a tenderness that stayed within the boundary of respect. Lucia looked back, feeling her own warmth, her own steadiness. Outside, the night air was cool and gentle as they stepped onto the sidewalk. The café behind them hummed softly, but the street itself felt calm. Tomas walked Lucia partway home, not because she needed escort, but because the shared pace felt like a continuation of their practice. They spoke a little, small reflections, quiet gratitude for Valeria, for the room, for the weeks that had unfolded like slow music. When they reached Lucia's building, they stopped beneath the streetlight. Tomas did not reach for her without asking. His gaze held a question. Lucia felt the question, and she checked in with herself, as she had learned to do. The answer was gentle and clear. She stepped forward and rested her hand lightly on his arm. It was not a promise of forever. It was a promise of respect. Tomas covered her hand with his own, briefly, warmly, then let it rest without tightening. In that small touch, there was affection with edges, romance with a hearth. "Good night, Lucia," he said softly. "Good night, Tomas," she replied. Lucia went upstairs and entered her apartment. The rooms greeted her with their familiar quiet, but tonight the quiet felt different. It felt like a bed freshly made, clean and ready. She opened the balcony door and stepped outside. The night air touched her face with cool kindness. The city stretched below, lights scattered like gentle stars. Somewhere far away, a bandoneon played faintly, or perhaps it was only her memory carrying the sound. Lucia rested her hands on the balcony railing and breathed in slowly, feeling her chest rise and fall with calm ease. She thought of forgetting, not erasing, but releasing. She thought of remembering, not clinging, but honoring. She thought of the dance of yes and no, of stepping forward and stepping back, of stopping without fear. And she felt, in the quiet of her own body, a new kind of romance. Not the kind that burns fast and consumes, but the kind that warms steadily, protected by clear boundaries. Inside, she prepared for sleep with unhurried movements. She washed her face, changed into a soft nightdress, turned off lamps one by one. Each small act felt like a lullaby performed by hands. When she finally lay down, the sheets cool and smooth beneath her, she let her breath slow. She imagined the Tango studio's warm light, the polished wood, Valeria's calm voice. She imagined the music that did not demand, the pauses that held safety, the stop that was kindness. She imagined her own heart as a hearth, strong, clear-edged, capable of warmth without wildfire. May your night be gentle, like a slow tango. May your breath find its calm rhythm. May your heart rest within its safe boundaries, warm and steady. And may deep sleep come to you softly now, like a quiet blessing settling over the city, like a kind hand turning off the last light, like morning patiently waiting to be born.